London, 1832. London's rain fell like teardrops against the window panes of Ravenshire House, marking 2 weeks since the scandal had erupted across society like wildfire in a dry summer. 2 weeks since the Duchess of Ravenshire had vanished without a trace. Charles, the Duke of Ravenshire, stood motionless by the grand fireplace, his reflection fractured in the ornate mirror above. His fingers traced the edges of a hand-drawn map, worn from constant handling. "Your Grace," his butler interrupted, hovering at the doorway like a spectre. "Lady Whistledown's latest paper has arrived." Charles didn't turn. "And I suppose my wife's disappearance features prominently?" "The second paragraph, sir." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Burn it." "As you wish, Your Grace." Left alone once more, Charles unfolded the map completely. It was crudely drawn, showing a coastal path ending at what appeared to be a small village. In the corner, a peculiar symbol, a rose pierced by an arrow. "Why did you leave this behind, Margaret?" he whispered to the empty room. Was it an invitation, a taunt, or simply a mistake? Society whispered that the Duchess had fled in fear, that the cold, demanding Duke had driven her away with his impossible expectations and frozen heart. But something about the map made him doubt the simplistic narrative that had spread through London's ballrooms like plague. His finger paused over a small detail he hadn't noticed before, a slight smudge in the ink, as though a tear had fallen while the map was being drawn. "You were crying," he realized, a revelation that twisted something painful in his chest. In 5 years of marriage, he had never seen Margaret cry. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. "I will find you," he said to the map, to the storm, to the ghost of his wife that seemed to linger in every corner of their once shared home. "Even if this leads nowhere. Even if it's a trap." The clock struck midnight as Charles made his decision. He would follow the map, even knowing it might be a lie, even knowing he might never find her. But first, he needed to understand why she had disappeared in the first place. Society had their theories, of course. The Morning Post claimed she had run away with a dashing naval officer. Lady Featherington swore she had witnessed the Duchess boarding a ship to America. Lord Berkeley insisted she had joined a convent after discovering her husband's alleged affair. None knew the truth, that their final conversation had ended with the Duchess receiving a letter that turned her pale as death, that she had locked herself in her chambers for 3 days before disappearing, leaving nothing behind but this curious map. By morning, the rain had cleared, and Charles had made his preparations. His valet looked on in astonishment as the Duke packed his own trunk, selecting practical clothing instead of his usual finery. "Your Grace, shall I accompany you?" the bewildered servant asked. "No, Simmons. This journey I make alone." "But where shall I tell the callers you've gone?" Charles paused, considering. "Tell them I've gone to retrieve what's mine." As his carriage pulled away from Ravenshire House, Charles caught sight of Lady Danbury watching from her window across the square. No doubt by tea-time, all of London would know the Duke had left in pursuit of his runaway bride. Let them talk. Let them speculate. He had a map to follow, even if it led nowhere at all. The coastal village of Pemberton appeared at first glance to be nothing special, merely a collection of weathered cottages clinging to cliffs above a restless sea. Charles stepped down from his hired carriage, map in hand, squinting against the salt spray that seemed to coat everything in a fine mist. "You'll be wanting rooms at the Siren's Call, I expect," said the driver, nodding toward a modest inn at the village center. "Only place that takes gentlemen visitors, such as yourself." Charles pressed a coin into the man's palm. "I'm looking for someone, a woman who might have arrived here within the past fortnight." The driver's face closed like a book. "Many come and go here, sir. I don't keep track." Interesting, Charles thought. The first lie of many, no doubt. The Siren's Call proved to be cleaner than its exterior suggested. A plump woman with shrewd eyes greeted him at the counter, giving his fine clothing a suspicious once-over. "We don't get many noblemen here," she remarked, pushing the registry book toward him. "I'm not here as a nobleman," Charles replied, signing simply as Mr. Ravenshire. "I'm looking for my wife." The innkeeper's face revealed nothing. "Lost her, have you?" "In a manner of speaking." Well, I haven't seen any lost wives lately. Charles slid the registry back across the counter. She has dark hair, green eyes that change color with her mood, a voice like velvet when she speaks, which isn't often. Something flickered across the woman's face. Recognition, perhaps. Or wariness. That describes half the women in England, sir, she replied, handing him a key. Room 3, up the stairs and to your left. Supper's at 6. Charles took the key but remained standing at the counter. My wife would have been carrying a small leather trunk with a rose design on the clasp. The innkeeper turned away. I've rooms to clean, sir. I'll make it worth your while. Not everything has a price, Your Grace. Charles froze. He had not revealed his title. The innkeeper smiled thinly. Yes, we know who you are. News travels, even to forgotten places like Pemberton. Especially news of a duchess who flees her grand London home. Then you admit she was here. I admit nothing. The woman's eyes hardened. But I'll give you some advice, free of charge. Sometimes people leave because they must, not because they wish to. And sometimes the safest place to hide is the last place anyone would think to look. With that cryptic statement, she disappeared into a back room, leaving Charles alone with more questions than answers. That evening, as Charles sat in the inn's small dining room, picking at a surprisingly excellent fish stew, he observed his fellow diners with careful attention. A weathered fisherman and his equally weathered wife, a nervous-looking clergyman, and a solitary woman in the corner, face obscured by the hood of her cloak. The hooded woman felt his gaze and lifted her head slightly. For a breathtaking moment, Charles thought he glimpsed Margaret's distinctive profile, but the woman quickly turned away, gathered her things, and hurried from the room. Charles rose to follow, but the innkeeper appeared at his side with a fresh loaf of bread, effectively blocking his path. The sea air gives a man an appetite, she said pointedly. Best finish your meal, sir. By the time Charles had maneuvered around her, the mysterious woman had vanished. Later that night, unable to sleep, Charles stood at his window overlooking the moonlit harbor. A figure stood on the distant cliffs, a woman, her cloak billowing in the night wind. Though too far to see clearly, something in her stance seemed achingly familiar. As if sensing his gaze, she turned toward the village, toward his window. Then, with deliberate slowness, she raised her hand in what might have been a greeting, or a warning. By morning, the village had transformed. Doors that had been open were now closed. Villagers who had nodded politely now averted their eyes. Even the innkeeper's welcoming demeanor had chilled considerably. They were closing ranks, protecting something, or someone. Charles decided to change tactics. If the villagers wouldn't speak to a duke, perhaps they'd speak to a man with a purpose they understood. He abandoned his fine clothes for the simple attire he'd packed, rolled up his sleeves, and offered his assistance to a fisherman struggling with his nets. "Don't need help from the likes of you," the man grunted. "The likes of me?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "You mean someone with 2 strong arms and time to spare?" The fisherman spat on the ground. "You know what I mean. I'm just a man looking for his wife. Some things are better left unfound." Charles grabbed the man's arm. "Is she in danger?" The fisherman's weathered face softened slightly. "Not from us, sir. Never from us." "Then from whom?" The man looked out to sea, his expression distant. "There are currents beneath the water that can pull a man down before he knows he's sinking. Understand?" Charles released his grip. "I understand that everyone in this village speaks in riddles." "Not riddles. Caution." The fisherman returned to his nets. "The lady with the velvet voice came here for a reason. Maybe you should ask yourself what that reason might be, instead of asking us where she's gone." That afternoon, Charles explored the village systematically, comparing landmarks to his map. The path led inland, away from the shoreline, toward a dense copse of trees crowning a small hill. According to the map, something important waited there. The grove was cool and silent, dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. At its center stood the ruins of a small stone cottage, long abandoned. Charles circled it once, noting the crumbling walls and collapsed roof. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that explained why Margaret would have marked this place. Frustrated, he kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering across the ground to reveal something pale beneath, a scrap of fabric. Bending down, Charles retrieved a handkerchief, the fine linen now dirty but still bearing the unmistakable embroidered M in one corner. Margaret's. His heart hammered in his chest as he searched the ruins more carefully. Near what had once been a hearth, he discovered a small hollow beneath a flat stone, clearly used as a hiding place. Inside lay a half-burned letter, the remaining text too charred to read, and something else, a hair ribbon of deep burgundy velvet, the exact shade Margaret had worn the night they first danced. Charles sat back on his heels, clutching these small treasures. She had been here, recently enough that rain hadn't destroyed the handkerchief, deliberately enough to leave the ribbon where only a thorough search would find it. But why? As the sun began to set, Charles made his way back toward the village. At the edge of the trees he paused, sensing he was not alone. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. "You might as well show yourself," he called. "I know you're there." Silence answered him, but the distinct feeling of being watched remained. "Margaret?" He spoke her name softly, hopefully. "Is it you?" The only response was the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Charles returned to the inn as darkness fell. In his room, he laid out his discoveries: the map, the handkerchief, the ribbon, and the burned letter fragment. Pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet assemble. A knock at his door startled him from his contemplation. "Who is it?" he called, quickly gathering the items and concealing them in his coat pocket. "Just me, sir, with fresh towels," came the innkeeper's voice. Charles opened the door to find her standing there, arms indeed, laden with linens. "Thank you, but that wasn't necessary," he said. She thrust the towels into his hands. "Everyone deserves clean things," she said meaningfully. As she turned to leave, she added in a much lower voice, "The cliffs at dawn. Come alone." Before Charles could question her, she was gone, her footsteps already fading down the hallway. Sleep eluded him that night. Charles lay awake, watching moonlight slide across the ceiling, thinking of Margaret. They had been married 5 years, yet he realized with a sudden clarity that he knew precious little about his wife's thoughts, her fears, her dreams. Their marriage had been arranged, of course, a business transaction between his title and her father's fortune. But there had been moments, brief, shining moments, when something more seemed possible. The way she laughed, unguarded, when he'd made an uncharacteristic joke at Lord Rutherford's insufferable dinner party. The gentle touch of her hand on his arm when he'd lost his temper with an incompetent steward. The night she'd fallen asleep in the library, a book of poetry open on her lap, and he'd carried her to bed without waking her. Small moments, insignificant perhaps, yet now they seemed like missed opportunities, chances for connection he'd been too proud, too reserved, too damned ducal to seize. And now she was gone. Dawn found Charles standing on the windswept cliffs, collar turned up against the chill. The sea below was slate gray, white-capped waves crashing against jagged rocks, a perfect metaphor for his current state of mind. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, expecting the innkeeper. Instead, he found himself face to face with the mysterious hooded woman from the dining room. She pulled back her hood, revealing not Margaret's face, but that of an older woman with the same striking green eyes. "You must be Charles," she said, her accent suggesting education despite her simple dress. "I am Eleanor Crawford, Margaret's aunt." Charles stared at her, stunned. "Margaret has no aunt. Her parents died years ago, and she was an only child." The woman smiled sadly. "Is that what they told you? What they told her?" "There is much about your wife's family you do not know, Your Grace. Much about your wife herself, I suspect." "Where is she?" Charles demanded, taking a step toward the woman. "Is she safe?" For the moment, Eleanor gazed out at the churning sea. "But she won't be if you continue this pursuit so openly. There are eyes everywhere, even here." "Whose eyes? What danger threatens my wife?" "The same danger that has always threatened her. The same shadows that have followed her since childhood." Eleanor turned back to him, her expression grave. Did you never wonder why a family with such wealth would marry their daughter to a duke who, forgive me, was known to have more title than fortune at the time? Charles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was a suitable match. My title, their money. A convenient explanation, but not the truth. Then tell me the truth. Eleanor shook her head. That is not my story to tell, but I will tell you this. The map you found was meant to mislead, not guide. Margaret left it, hoping you would follow a false trail while she pursued the truth elsewhere. The truth about what? About who she really is, about what was stolen from her. Eleanor reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into Charles's palm. She will be at the place where you first saw her smile, not the ballroom where you met, but later. You'll know. Charles opened his hand to find a small silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman who could only be Margaret's mother, given their striking resemblance. Why the secrecy? Why not simply tell me what's happening? Because she's protecting you, Eleanor said simply. Just as she's always protected those she cares for. I don't need protection. Don't you? Eleanor's gaze was piercing. The Duke of Ravensshire, who lost his parents under mysterious circumstances. Who became one of England's youngest dukes, with enemies circling like vultures around a wounded lion. Are you certain you know who those enemies are, Your Grace? Before Charles could respond, Eleanor was already walking away. Remember, she called over her shoulder, the place where you first saw her smile. She'll wait 3 days, no longer. Left alone on the cliff, Charles clutched the locket and stared out at the vast, uncaring sea. The place where he first saw her smile. Not at their introduction, not at their wedding. It had been after, much after. Charles closed his eyes, thinking back through the early, polite months of their marriage. And then he remembered. A small cottage on the edge of his country estate. A surprise storm. Taking shelter together, just the two of them, no servants, no society. Margaret, laughing as she tried to light the fire herself, soot smudged across her cheek. The first time he'd seen her truly smile. Hampshire, he whispered to the wind. She's in Hampshire. The journey to Hampshire took longer than Charles would have liked, delayed by a broken carriage wheel and storms that turned roads to mud. When he finally arrived at his country estate, Ravensshire Park, his steward was visibly surprised to see him. Your Grace, we had no word of your visit. Because I sent none, Charles replied, striding past him. Has anyone else arrived recently? A woman, perhaps? The steward hesitated. No, Your Grace, but there was a letter delivered by private messenger yesterday. The boy insisted it was to be given only into your hands, should you appear. Charles's heart quickened. Where is it? In your study, Your Grace. I took the liberty of placing it in the safe. Minutes later, Charles sat at his desk, the sealed letter before him. No address, no name. Just his ducal seal pressed into deep blue wax, a seal that only his household would recognize. He broke it open. Charles, if you are reading this, you've solved my first puzzle. I should have known your mind was too sharp to be led astray for long. By now, you've surely heard the rumors. That I've run away with a lover. That I've fled your cruelty. That I've joined a convent or sailed to America, or any number of ridiculous tales that London's gossips have invented to explain my absence. None are true. I left to protect you, though I know your pride will rebel at the very notion. There are forces at work that you cannot begin to understand, forces that have shaped both our lives in ways neither of us comprehended when we wed. I cannot explain everything in writing. Words on paper can be intercepted, read, used against us. If you truly wish to find me, look to the woodcutter's cottage at the edge of the West Woods. Come at sunset tomorrow. Come alone. Tell no one, not even those you trust most within your household. If you decide this mystery is not worth unraveling, I will understand. Return to London. Tell society whatever tale suits you best to explain my continued absence. I will not resurface to contradict it. The choice, as always, is yours. Monsieur Charles read the letter twice more, searching for clues, for the meaning beneath the words. His wife's elegant handwriting was unmistakable, but there was a tension in the script, as though each word had been carefully chosen, carefully crafted. The woodcutter's cottage, the place where they had taken shelter from the storm 3 years ago, the place where he had first seen Margaret's genuine smile, her careful composure briefly abandoned in the face of their unexpected adventure. He had kissed her that night, he remembered, not the dutiful public kisses they had shared before, but something real, something that had surprised them both with its intensity. They had never spoken of it afterward, had returned to their polite, distant marriage as if that moment of connection had never occurred. What a fool he had been. Charles spent the night poring over his family records, his father's journals, searching for any hint of the forces Margaret had mentioned. He found nothing suspicious, just the normal correspondence of a ducal household, the expected records of estates and incomes. If there were secrets, they were well hidden. The following day dragged endlessly. Charles kept to his study, avoiding his curious staff, watching the sun's agonizingly slow journey across the sky. When it finally began its descent toward the horizon, he slipped out through the gardens, taking a circuitous route to avoid being seen. The woodcutter's cottage stood just as he remembered, small but solidly built, sheltered by ancient oaks. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign someone waited within. Charles approached cautiously, senses alert for any sign of danger or deception. When he reached the door, he paused, suddenly uncertain. What if this was indeed a trap? What if the letter had not been from Margaret at all? Too late for doubts. He knocked. Silence answered him. He knocked again, more insistently. The door swung open, and there she stood. Margaret, Duchess of Ravensshire, dressed not in the finery of her station, but in a simple gown of deep green that matched her eyes. Her dark hair was braided simply down her back, free of the elaborate styles she wore in London. She was thinner than he remembered, with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. But she was still the most beautiful woman Charles had ever seen. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. "You came," she finally said, her voice that familiar velvet that had haunted his dreams. "Did you doubt I would?" A sad smile touched her lips. "I have learned not to expect anything, Your Grace." The formality stung. "Charles," he corrected. "Here, now. I am just Charles." Margaret stepped back, allowing him to enter. The cottage interior was sparse but comfortable, a fire crackling in the hearth, simple furniture, a table set for two. "You were expecting me," he observed. "I was hoping," she corrected. "There's a difference." Charles removed his coat, taking in the space. "The last time we were here, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs. I've had time to make it habitable." Margaret moved to the fire, stirring something in a pot that smelled surprisingly appetizing. "I've had to learn many things these past weeks. Such as how to disappear without a trace?" She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Among other skills." "Margaret." Charles stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse fluttering at her throat. "Why did you leave? The truth, not riddles." She set down the spoon and faced him fully. "Because I discovered that our marriage was built on a foundation of lies, not ours. We were both merely pieces moved across a chessboard by players with more power and fewer scruples." "What lies? Whose?" "My father's, for one." She gestured toward the table. "Please, sit. This is not a conversation to have on an empty stomach." Reluctantly, Charles complied. Margaret served a simple but delicious stew, along with bread that she had clearly baked herself. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the occasional call of an owl outside. "Your father has been dead for 6 years, Charles finally said. "What could he possibly have to do with your disappearance now?" Margaret set down her spoon. "What if I told you my father isn't dead? What if I told you the man who raised me, the man who arranged our marriage, was not my father at all?" Charles stared at her. "I would say you've taken leave of your senses." "I thought the same when I first received the letter." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper, sliding it across the table to him. "This arrived the day before I disappeared." Charles unfolded the letter, scanning its contents with increasing disbelief. My dearest daughter, you do not know me, but I have watched over you from afar all these years. The man who raised you, who calls himself Thomas Crawford, is a thief and a murderer. He stole not only my fortune, but my most precious treasure, you. I can prove everything. The map enclosed will lead you to the first piece of evidence. Come alone. Tell no one, especially not your husband. The Duke of Ravenshire's father was Thomas Crawford's closest ally. The son cannot be trusted with this truth. I will find you when the time is right. Your true father, William Blackwood. Charles looked up, stunned. This is madness. William Blackwood died in a shipwreck 20 years ago. Everyone knows this. Everyone was told this, Margaret corrected. Just as everyone was told Thomas Crawford was my father. And you believed this obvious deception? Enough to flee your home, your husband, your life? Margaret's eyes flashed. I didn't flee on the basis of this letter alone. I investigated. The map led me to Pemberton, to the ruins of a cottage where my mother once lived. There I found her journals, hidden beneath the hearthstone. She rose and moved to a small trunk in the corner, unlocking it with a key she wore around her neck. From it, she withdrew a weathered leather book. My mother's handwriting, she said, returning to the table, detailing her secret marriage to William Blackwood, their happiness, my birth. And then her fear when Thomas Crawford began threatening them, claiming William had cheated him in a business venture. Charles accepted the journal, turning the pages carefully. The handwriting matched letters he had seen among Margaret's possessions, letters she had told him were from a childhood governess. According to her final entry, Margaret continued, William was not lost at sea as reported. He fled to protect us, to draw Crawford's rage away from his wife and infant daughter. My mother believed he was still alive, in hiding. She died believing he would return for us someday. And you believe this as well? Charles asked carefully. I believe something happened that was deliberately concealed. I believe my mother was not the fanciful hysteric that Crawford painted her as after her death. Margaret's voice hardened. And I believe the fortune that came with me into our marriage was never Crawford's to give. Charles sat back, mind racing. What does this have to do with my father? With me? Margaret's expression softened slightly. Perhaps nothing. The letter could have mentioned your father simply to isolate me, to ensure I told no one of my plans. But I couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk you. By keeping me in the dark, you put me at greater risk, Charles argued. I've been searching for you for weeks, following false trails, exposed to whatever dangers might be lurking. I left the map as a distraction, she admitted. I never thought you would actually follow it. Charles leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Why would you think I wouldn't search for my own wife? Margaret looked away. Because in 5 years of marriage, Charles, you have never once sought my company when society didn't demand it. Never once asked for my thoughts on any matter of importance. Never once treated me as anything but a beautiful ornament to enhance your ducal prestige. The words struck him like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. That doesn't mean I don't... He stopped, uncertain how to continue. Care? Margaret supplied. Perhaps you do, in your way. But not enough to know me. Not really. Charles reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. I'm here now. I want to know. Everything. Margaret studied him, her green eyes searching his face for some sign of sincerity. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, for she nodded slowly. Very well. But knowing means you cannot return to ignorance. Knowing means you become part of this, whatever this may be. I already am part of it. I became part of it the day I married you. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Yes, I suppose you did. She withdrew her hand gently and stood, moving to the window to check the gathering darkness outside. We should continue this conversation in the morning, she said. It's not safe to speak of such things after dark, even here. Charles raised an eyebrow. You believe we're being watched? I know we are. Margaret drew the curtains closed. I've glimpsed the same man 3 times since arriving here, always at a distance, always disappearing when I try to approach. Why didn't you tell me immediately? I'm telling you now. She turned to face him. There's a pallet by the fire. I'll take the bed in the other room. Charles stood, suddenly acutely aware of the intimate setting, of how long it had been since they had been truly alone together. Margaret, he began, not entirely sure what he wanted to say. She shook her head slightly. Not tonight, Charles. There's too much between us, too many truths yet to be spoken. Get some rest. Tomorrow will bring challenges enough. With that, she retreated to the small bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Charles stood motionless in the main room, listening to the fire crackle and pop in the silence she left behind. He had found his wife, but she remained as enigmatic as ever, perhaps more so. Still, something had changed between them in this small cottage. Something significant. For the first time in their marriage, they had spoken honestly to one another. It was, Charles reflected, as he prepared his makeshift bed, an unexpectedly promising beginning. Charles woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of Margaret moving quietly about the cottage. Sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing dust motes dancing in golden beams. For a moment, he simply watched his wife as she worked, struck by how naturally she moved in these humble surroundings, so different from the grand halls of their London home. "You're staring," she said without turning around. "You always know when someone is watching you," he observed, sitting up. "Even at balls you could sense eyes upon you before you saw who looked." A small smile touched her lips as she turned, offering him a steaming cup. "A survival skill. One learns to feel when one is being observed." Charles accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "What other skills have you been hiding, Duchess?" "Many." Her eyes met his briefly before she returned to the small stove. "And I am not a duchess here." "You are always a duchess," Charles countered. "Title clings to you, regardless of your surroundings." Margaret's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Perhaps that's the problem. Perhaps I've never been seen as anything but a title. The Duchess, the heiress, the daughter. Never simply Margaret." The observation struck uncomfortably close to his earlier thoughts. Had he ever truly seen her as anything but the Duchess of Ravenshire? Had anyone? "I see you now," he said quietly. She glanced over her shoulder, expression skeptical. "Do you?" Before he could answer, a sharp knock at the door froze them both. Margaret's eyes widened in alarm. No one was supposed to know they were here. Charles rose smoothly, motioning for her to stay back as he approached the door cautiously. "Who calls?" he demanded. "A friend of the Blackwoods," came a muffled reply. "I bring news and warning." Charles looked to Margaret, who nodded slowly, though her face remained tense. He opened the door to reveal a middle-aged man in modest but well-kept clothes, his salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed, his bearing suggesting military background. "Captain James Wilson," the man introduced himself with a slight bow. "Former first mate to William Blackwood. May I enter, Your Grace? It's unwise to be seen conversing on doorsteps these days." Charles stepped aside, allowing the man in, but positioning himself between the visitor and Margaret. "You served my father?" Margaret asked directly. Wilson studied her face with evident emotion. "You have his eyes, though your mother's features." "Yes, I served William Blackwood for 15 years, until the day Crawford's men attacked our ship." "Then he is truly dead," Margaret said, disappointment evident in her voice. "Not dead, in hiding." Wilson glanced nervously at the window. "And he sent me to find you once he learned you had received his message." Charles's skepticism must have shown on his face, for Wilson addressed him directly. "You doubt me, Your Grace. Wise, given the circumstances. But I can prove my connection." He reached into his coat and withdrew a pocket watch, handing it to Margaret. "Your father's. He asked me to tell you that he placed a lock of your baby hair inside it the day you were christened. No one but he would know that." Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the watch. Inside, just as described, was a tiny golden curl preserved under glass. "Why now?" Charles demanded while Margaret examined the keepsake. Why wait all these years to contact his daughter? Because until recently, he believed she was safe, unaware of her true heritage, yes, but protected by her ignorance. Wilson accepted the chair Margaret offered him. It was only when he learned of Crawford's death that he began to investigate, to plan his return. What he discovered alarmed him greatly. "What did he discover?" Margaret asked, returning to Charles's side. Wilson looked between them. "That Crawford had arranged your marriage to the Duke of Ravenshire specifically to gain access to certain papers in the Ravenshire family vault. Papers that could prove William Blackwood is alive and the rightful owner of the Crawford shipping empire." Charles stiffened. "That's absurd. My father would never—" "Your father died before the wedding," Wilson interrupted. "Did you never wonder why Crawford was so insistent the marriage proceed, even during a period of mourning?" A cold feeling settled in Charles's stomach. It was true. Thomas Crawford had been remarkably inflexible about the wedding date, refusing to postpone despite the recent death of the old Duke. "These papers," Margaret said slowly, "what exactly do they contain?" "Proof of partnership. William and your father, Your Grace, were business associates. When Crawford orchestrated William's death, he needed your father's signature on documents transferring William's shares to himself. Your father initially refused, until Crawford threatened his family." Charles recalled his mother's sudden illness shortly before his father's equally unexpected death. Physicians had been baffled by her symptoms, which had appeared almost overnight and resisted all treatment. "You're suggesting Crawford poisoned my mother to coerce my father." "I'm stating it plainly," Wilson confirmed. "And when your father finally signed the papers, Crawford ensured neither parent would live to reveal the truth." Margaret gasped softly. Charles found her hand and gripped it tightly, his mind reeling with implications. "If what you say is true," he said carefully, "then Crawford arranged our marriage not for the usual reasons of title and fortune, but to ensure I would never discover these papers, or their significance." "Precisely." Wilson nodded. He believed a grateful son-in-law would never question his benefactor's past. And should you ever stumble upon the evidence, your own complicity in enjoying Crawford's stolen fortune would silence you. "But Crawford is dead," Margaret pointed out. "Who threatens us now?" Wilson's expression darkened. "Crawford's partner. The man who helped orchestrate everything. The man who now controls the empire they built on William's downfall." "Who?" Charles demanded. "Lord Reginald Blackthorne, Earl of Wexford." The name struck Charles like a physical blow. Lord Blackthorne, his godfather. The man who had guided him after his parents' death. The man who had encouraged him to accept Crawford's offer for Margaret's hand. "Impossible," he breathed. "Blackthorne was my father's closest friend." "The most dangerous enemies often wear the mask of friendship," Wilson said grimly. "Why do you think Blackthorne has been such a constant presence in your life? He was watching you, ensuring you never stumbled upon the truth. The pieces were falling into terrible place. Blackthorne's frequent visits, his careful questions about the estate papers, his insistence on helping Charles manage the Ravenshire affairs after his father's death. If this is true," Charles said slowly, "then Blackthorne knows I've left London in search of Margaret. He'll assume I'm learning the truth. He already knows." Wilson reached inside his coat again, withdrawing a crumpled notice. "This is being circulated in every port and posting house between here and London." Charles smoothed the paper to reveal a reward notice. £1,000 for information leading to the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, described as suffering from a dangerous mutual delusion and in need of medical confinement. "He's laying groundwork to declare us insane if we speak out," Margaret realized aloud. £1,000 will have every desperate soul in England looking for us. And those who find you may not be gentle in their methods, Wilson added grimly. Blackthorne cares only that you're silenced, not how. Charles paced the small room, mind racing. We need those papers from the Ravenshire vault. Without proof, it's our word against an earl's. You can't return to your estate, Wilson warned. It's undoubtedly watched. Not the main estate. Charles turned to Margaret. The hunting lodge in Scotland. My grandfather built a second vault there, a precaution during the Jacobite troubles. My father maintained the tradition, keeping duplicates of all important papers. Hope flickered in Margaret's eyes. How do we reach Scotland undetected? Every road will be watched. Not every road. Charles's expression turned determined. And not by land. Wilson nodded approvingly. The sea. William's old smuggling connections could help. Smuggling connections? Margaret echoed, surprised. My father was a smuggler? A merchant who occasionally transported goods outside official channels, Wilson corrected with a small smile. It's how he built his fleet before partnering with Crawford. Can you arrange passage? Charles asked. From Pemberton, 3 days from now. Wilson stood. I must return before my absence is noted. Blackthorn has spies everywhere. Wait, Margaret said, catching his arm. My father. Is he in England? Will I see him? Wilson's expression softened. He waits in Scotland, near your hunting lodge. He's arranged everything for your arrival. He patted her hand gently. He has waited 20 years to hold his daughter again. A few more days will not defeat him. After Wilson departed, Charles and Margaret sat in silence, each processing the staggering revelations. Do you believe him? Margaret finally asked. I don't want to, Charles admitted. But too many pieces fit. Too many questions I've had about my parents' deaths suddenly have answers. He looked at her intently. The greater question is whether you believe him. Margaret touched the pocket watch she now wore around her neck. This was my mother's most treasured possession. She used to open it each night before bed, though she never showed me what was inside. I believe Wilson is who he claims to be. Her eyes met his. But that doesn't mean we should trust him completely. Charles nodded, impressed by her caution. Agreed. We follow his plan to Pemberton, but remain vigilant. Trust no one, absolutely. Even each other? There was a challenge in her voice. Especially each other, Charles said with unexpected lightness, given our history of miscommunication. A startled laugh escaped her, the sound warming something long cold in Charles's chest. We should leave immediately, he continued, reluctant to break this newfound moment of connection. Blackthorn's men could arrive at any time. I'll need 5 minutes to gather my things. Margaret rose gracefully. You packed light for a Duchess on the run. She paused at the bedroom door, a half-smile touching her lips. I'm not a Duchess here, remember? Just Margaret. Never just anything, Charles replied softly. Her eyes widened slightly at his words, a flush coloring her cheeks before she disappeared into the bedroom. Charles stared at the closed door, struck by the realization that in the span of a day he had learned more about his wife, her thoughts, her courage, her quick mind, than in 5 years of marriage. What a fool he had been, and what a greater fool he would be if he didn't seize this chance to truly know the woman he had married. The journey back to Pemberton proved more challenging than their departure from Ravensshire Park. Twice they spotted riders bearing the Earl of Wexford's livery, forcing them to divert through muddy back roads and dense woods. Charles was thankful for the plain clothes he had packed, which allowed them to pass as a farmer and his wife when they stopped at small village inns. Margaret surprised him with her adaptability. The woman who had been raised in luxury, who had never so much as dressed herself without a lady's maid, now moved through their rustic surroundings with remarkable ease. Don't look so astonished, she said on their second night, catching his expression as she skillfully mended a tear in his coat. I've always been capable. Society simply never required it of me. Society's loss, Charles replied, watching her nimble fingers work. Though I admit, I'm curious where you learned such skills. A shadow crossed her face. My mother taught me, before she died. Crawford. She stumbled slightly over the name. The man I thought was my father discouraged common activities. But my mother insisted some skills transcended class. She sounds remarkably wise. She was. Margaret tied off her thread and bit it with her teeth, a decidedly unladylike gesture that Charles found strangely endearing. I was only 12 when she died, but I remember her strength. Even as her health failed, she never surrendered her dignity. Charles accepted the mended coat. You have her strength. Margaret looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "You think me strong? I think you extraordinary," he answered honestly. "You discovered your entire life was built on lies, yet instead of collapsing, you set out alone to uncover the truth. Most women of our acquaintance would have taken to their beds with vinaigrette and smelling salts." A small, genuine smile curved her lips. "Most women of our acquaintance have never had to be anything but decorative. Necessity reveals capability, I've discovered." "Indeed it does." Charles hesitated, then added, "I find I prefer the capable Margaret to the decorative Duchess." Her smile faltered slightly. "Yet you married the Duchess." "I married a stranger arranged by my guardian." Charles sat beside her on the small inn bed, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that somehow still clung to her. "I'm only now beginning to know my wife." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment before looking away. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be difficult." Charles nodded, accepting her retreat. They had years of distance to overcome. It would not happen in a matter of days. But for the first time, he felt hope that it might happen at all. They reached Pemberton at dusk the following day, approaching cautiously from the inland road rather than the main coastal path. The village appeared unchanged, quiet in the gathering darkness, fishing boats bobbing gently in the harbor. "Wilson said to meet at the siren's call at midnight," Margaret whispered, as they huddled in the shelter of a fisherman's abandoned shed. "But I don't like how exposed the inn seems." Charles studied the village layout. "Agreed. Any contact with Wilson should be away from public view. The ruins where you found your mother's journal. Could we wait there?" Margaret nodded. "It's close enough to observe the inn without being seen. If Wilson is true to his word, we can intercept him on his way." They made their way carefully to the hilltop grove as full darkness fell. The ruins seemed more foreboding by night, shadows shifting between crumbling walls as clouds scudded across the moon. "This was your mother's home?" Charles asked softly, as they settled into a sheltered corner. "Before she married," Margaret confirmed. "According to her journal, she lived here with her grandmother after her parents died. It's where she met my father, my real father. He was delivering supplies to the village when a storm forced him to seek shelter. A fitting place for us to begin our journey to find him." Margaret glanced at him, expression unreadable in the darkness. "You truly believe we'll find him? That Wilson's tale is true?" Charles considered his answer carefully. "I believe something happened 20 years ago that altered the course of many lives. Whether your father lives, whether he is the man Wilson describes, that remains to be seen." "A diplomatic answer, Your Grace. An honest one, Margaret." He found her hand in the darkness, covering it with his own. "I promise you this. Whatever truth we find, we face it together." Her fingers curled around his, warm despite the night's chill. "Together," she echoed softly. They sat in companionable silence, watching the distant lights of the village. Shortly before midnight, a figure emerged from the siren's call, tall, moving with the unmistakable gait of Captain Wilson. Charles squeezed Margaret's hand. "There he is." As Wilson made his way up the path toward the ruins, Charles noted how often the captain glanced over his shoulder, checking for followers. "He's being cautious," Margaret observed. "Or leading someone to us," Charles replied grimly. "Stay here. I'll approach him alone." Before she could protest, Charles slipped away, circling through the trees to intercept Wilson from an unexpected direction. He watched the captain enter the ruins, looking around in apparent confusion when he found them empty. "Wilson," Charles called softly, stepping from the shadows. The captain whirled, hand reaching inside his coat before recognition dawned. "Your Grace, you startled me." "Were you followed?" Charles asked without preamble. "No. I've been careful." Wilson's eyes darted around the ruins. "Where is the Duchess?" "Safe," Charles replied, not yet ready to reveal her location. "What arrangements have you made?" Wilson relaxed slightly. "A fishing boat waits in the cove beyond the village. The captain is an old associate of William's, completely trustworthy. He'll take you up the coast to a larger vessel bound for Scotland." "When do we leave?" "Immediately. The tide turns in an hour." Wilson produced a small leather pouch. Money, new papers, and a letter of introduction to William's contact in Scotland. Everything you need. Charles accepted the pouch but made no move to signal Margaret. One thing troubles me, Captain. What's that, Your Grace? How did you know to find us at this particular cottage? We told no one of our destination. Wilson's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. William guessed. He said if his daughter had truly received her mother's journal, she would seek shelter in places connected to her past. A reasonable assumption, Charles acknowledged, except for one detail. Margaret didn't know this was her mother's cottage until after she arrived in Pemberton. The journal was hidden here. She didn't bring it with her. Wilson's hand moved subtly toward his coat. Perhaps I misunderstood William's explanation. Perhaps. Charles's voice hardened. Or perhaps William Blackwood never sent you at all. Perhaps it was Lord Blackthorne who dispatched you to find us. Wilson's face transformed, affability replaced by cold calculation. You're cleverer than Blackthorne gave you credit for, Your Grace. A common mistake, Charles replied, aware that Margaret had emerged from hiding behind Wilson, a heavy branch in her hands. People tend to underestimate those born to privilege. A mistake I won't repeat. Wilson drew a pistol from inside his coat. Now, call your wife out from wherever she's hiding, and we'll conclude this business with minimal unpleasantness. Margaret swung the branch, catching Wilson squarely across the shoulders. The captain stumbled forward with a cry of pain, the pistol discharging harmlessly into the ground. Charles lunged, tackling Wilson before he could recover. The men grappled in the dirt, Wilson's military training evident in his vicious counterattacks. A well-placed blow to Charles's ribs sent pain shooting through his side, but he maintained his grip, forcing the captain's arm behind his back until something snapped. Wilson howled, the fight draining from him as his shoulder dislocated. "Bind him!" Charles ordered, breathing heavily as he pinned the captain down. "There's rope in my pack." Margaret worked quickly, securing Wilson's hands and feet with the efficiency of someone who had read too many adventure novels. When she finished, Charles rolled the man onto his back. "Now, Captain, if that is indeed your rank, you'll tell us exactly who you are and what you know of William Blackwood." Wilson glared, sweat beading on his forehead from pain. "I know he's dead. Has been for 20 years, just as everyone believes." Margaret gasped softly. Charles kept his expression impassive. And the pocket watch? The lock of hair? A grimace that might have been a smile twisted Wilson's face. Crawford kept trophies. Blackthorne found the watch among his effects after his death. The hair could have been anyone's. Why the elaborate deception? Charles demanded. Why not simply capture or kill us? Blackthorne wants the papers, Wilson ground out. He doesn't know which documents might incriminate him. Needed you to lead him to all copies before eliminating you both. Margaret knelt beside the bound man, her face composed despite the betrayal. Is any part of your story true? Was my father murdered by Crawford and Blackthorne? Wilson hesitated, something like genuine regret crossing his features. Yes, that much is true. William Blackwood was a good man who trusted the wrong people. Crawford and Blackthorne arranged his death when he discovered their embezzlement from their joint ventures. And my mother? Was she truly William Blackwood's wife? She was. Wilson shifted uncomfortably, his dislocated shoulder causing evident pain. Crawford forced her to marry him afterward, to gain control of Blackwood's remaining assets held in trust for you. Charles watched Margaret absorb this confirmation, her spine straightening as another piece of her identity slid into place. The papers in the Ravenshire vault, Charles pressed. What do they contain that Blackthorne fears? Proof of the original partnership agreement, proof that Crawford had no legal claim to Blackwood's fortune. Wilson's breathing grew labored. And evidence of your father's murder. The old Duke suspected foul play in Blackwood's death and began investigating. That's why they killed him too. Margaret rose abruptly, moving a few paces away. Charles could see her struggling to maintain composure in the face of these brutal revelations. And our marriage? She asked without turning. Was that truly Crawford's scheme to ensure Charles never discovered the truth? Wilson nodded grimly. The ultimate insurance. Blackthorne arranged for Charles to become his ward after his parents' deaths. Crawford provided the beautiful, wealthy bride. Together, they ensured the last two people who might uncover their crimes would be bound in a loveless match, too occupied with society's demands to ask dangerous questions. The blunt assessment of their marriage hung in the air between them. Charles found he could not look at Margaret, could not bear to see agreement in her eyes. "What do we do with him?" she asked after a moment, her voice steady once more. Charles considered their options. "We can't release him, nor can we drag him with us." "The cellar," Margaret suggested. "There's an old root cellar beneath the cottage. Secure, but not fatal. Someone from the village will eventually check the ruins." Charles nodded. "Help me move him." Together, they half-dragged, half-carried the struggling Wilson to the cellar entrance. Before lowering him in, Charles retrieved the leather pouch the man had offered. "The money, at least, will be useful," he noted, checking the contents. "And I suspect the papers may be genuine, even if provided for nefarious purposes." "You're making a mistake," Wilson called as they prepared to close the cellar door. "Blackthorne has men everywhere. You'll never reach Scotland." "Perhaps not," Charles acknowledged, "but neither will you reach Blackthorne with news of our plans." As they secured the cellar, Margaret turned to Charles in the moonlight, her expression troubled. "If Wilson was false, then there is no boat waiting, no smuggler to take us north." "No," Charles agreed, "but his deception gives us valuable information. Blackthorne fears the papers in Scotland. That's where we must go." "How? Every road, every port will be watched." Charles smiled grimly. "Not every port. My family has connections Wilson and Blackthorne know nothing about." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "The Duke has secrets of his own?" "The Duke has resources," Charles corrected. "My mother's family were shipping merchants before marrying into nobility. Not all connections were severed when she became a duchess." For the first time since their journey began, Margaret looked at Charles as though truly seeing him. Not the Duke, not the husband of convenience, but the man himself. "It seems," she said softly, "that I know as little about you as you knew about me." Charles offered his hand to her. "Then perhaps it's time we properly introduced ourselves. Charles Ravenshire, at your service. Former lonely duke, current fugitive, and increasingly devoted husband." A smile touched her lips as she placed her hand in his. Margaret Blackwood Crawford Ravenshire, it seems. Former perfect duchess, current mystery even to herself, and increasingly intrigued wife. Their fingers intertwined as they stood among the ruins of her mother's past, the first genuine exchange of their long acquaintance hanging in the air between them like a promise. "Come," Charles said finally. "We have a long journey ahead, and dawn approaches." Together, they descended from the hilltop toward an uncertain future that for the first time they would truly face as one. The fishing village of Maplewood existed on no official map, nestled as it was in a hidden cove 20 miles north of Pemberton. Charles led Margaret along coastal paths so narrow and treacherous they seemed designed to discourage visitors, which, as he explained, was precisely the point. "My grandfather maintained connections here during the war with France," he told her as they picked their way down to the secluded harbor. "Officially for intelligence gathering. Unofficially, smuggling," Margaret supplied, carefully navigating the steep path in her borrowed boots. "It seems our families share a talent for operating outside the law." Charles offered his hand to help her over a particularly difficult section. A necessary skill when the law serves the powerful rather than the just. Margaret accepted his assistance but raised an eyebrow at his statement. "Rather revolutionary sentiments from a duke, Your Grace." "Perhaps I'm not the duke you thought you married," he replied with a hint of challenge. Her eyes met his, serious despite her light tone. "I'm beginning to believe that's true of us both." They reached the village as dusk gathered, a collection of stone cottages surrounding a natural harbor where several small boats bobbed in the gentle waves. Unlike Pemberton's obvious fishing industry, Maplewood showed few signs of regular commerce, precisely as intended, Charles explained. He led Margaret to the largest building, a weathered structure that served as both tavern and informal town hall. Inside, Conversations hushed as they entered, suspicious eyes evaluating the newcomers. Charles approached the bar directly, where a mountain of a man with a magnificent white beard was polishing glasses with methodical care. "I seek passage north," Charles stated without preamble. "On my mother's name, Eleanor Hargrove Ravenshire." The barman's hands stilled. His sharp eyes studied Charles's face, searching for resemblance to a woman long dead. "The Duchess had no children," he said finally, his voice surprisingly gentle for his imposing size. "She had one," Charles replied. "Born in the summer of 1804, during the great storm that sank the French frigate off Hargrove Point." The barman set down his glass and extended a massive hand. "William Frost, your mother saved my sister's life during that storm. Any son of hers is welcome in Maplewood." Charles clasped the offered hand, relief evident in his posture. "We need to reach Scotland." Quietly. Frost's eyes flickered to Margaret, who had remained slightly behind Charles. "And the lady?" "My wife," Charles said simply. "She travels under my mother's protection as well." The barman nodded once, acceptance granted. "The Silver Maid sails with the tide tomorrow, not to Scotland directly, too conspicuous, but she can take you to Newcastle. From there, arrangements can be made." "We're being pursued," Charles warned. "Men with resources and connections." "Aren't we all?" Frost replied with grim humor. "Rest easy, Your Grace. Maplewood has sheltered secrets far darker than yours. No strangers enter this village without every soul knowing within minutes." Margaret stepped forward, her natural dignity undiminished by travel-worn clothes. "We're grateful for your assistance, Mr. Frost." The big man bowed slightly, genuine respect in the gesture. "Any friend of the Hargroves is a friend of Maplewood, my lady. Eleanor never forgot her roots, even as a duchess. Her son and his wife will find only loyalty here." They were given a small but clean room above the tavern, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the harbor. For the first time since beginning their journey, a moment of awkwardness descended as they surveyed the intimate space. "I can sleep on the floor," Charles offered, setting down their meager belongings. Margaret shook her head. "Don't be absurd. We've shared a bed before." "Rarely," he noted, "and never in such close quarters." A flush touched her cheeks. "Nevertheless, your ribs are bruised from the fight with Wilson. You need proper rest." Charles couldn't argue with her practical assessment, though the prospect of sharing such a confined space after years of polite distance stirred unexpected nervousness. Their awkwardness was temporarily relieved by the arrival of a young girl bearing a tray with bread, cheese, and 2 bowls of hearty stew. They ate in companionable silence, both too hungry after their day's journey to waste energy on conversation. When they had finished, Margaret moved to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher to wash her face and hands. Charles watched surreptitiously as she removed the pins from her hair, allowing the dark waves to cascade down her back. It was a sight he had rarely been privileged to witness, even as her husband. "You're staring again," she said without turning. "You're beautiful," he replied simply. Margaret's hands stilled in the act of braiding her hair. She met his eyes in the small mirror above the washstand. "You've never said that to me, not like that." Charles frowned slightly. "Surely I have. I've complimented you at balls, at dinners. You've complimented the Duchess," she corrected gently. "Her gowns, her jewels, her suitable appearance on your arm, never just me." The distinction struck him forcefully. How many of their interactions had been performances for society rather than genuine exchanges between husband and wife? "I've been a poor husband," he acknowledged, moving to stand behind her. "But I would like to be a better one if you'll allow it." Margaret turned to face him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, smell the lavender that somehow still clung to her skin despite days of travel. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because of danger? Because of revelations about our families? Or because you've finally seen me as something more than an ornament for your title?" "All of those reasons," Charles admitted. "And because I'm discovering that the woman I married is far more extraordinary than I ever permitted myself to know." Margaret studied his face, searching for insincerity and finding none. Slowly, Hesitantly, she raised a hand to his cheek. "We were strangers forced into intimacy," she said. "Perhaps now we can be companions who choose it." Charles covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm, a gesture more intimate than any they had shared in years of marriage. "I would like that very much," he murmured against her skin. The air between them changed, charged with possibility. For a moment, Charles thought she might lean forward, might close the distance between them. But Margaret gently withdrew her hand. "We should rest," she said, though her voice held regret rather than rejection. "Tomorrow brings new challenges." Charles nodded, understanding her caution. They were building something fragile and precious between them, something that deserved more than a hasty consummation born of fear and uncertainty. They prepared for bed with careful courtesy, taking turns behind the privacy screen. When they finally lay side by side in the narrow bed, a respectable few inches between them, Charles found himself more aware of his wife's presence than he had been during any of their proper nights in their London mansion. "What will we do if we find these papers?" Margaret asked suddenly, her voice soft in the darkness. "If they truly prove what Wilson claimed?" Charles stared at the ceiling, considering. "We expose Blackthorn, reclaim your father's legacy, clear both our families' names. And afterward? When the scandal has subsided?" There was vulnerability in her question that touched something deep within him. She was asking about them, their future, their marriage. Charles turned on his side to face her, though he could barely make out her features in the dim light. "Afterward, I was thinking we might begin again. Not as a Duke and Duchess fulfilling society's expectations, but as Charles and Margaret, discovering who we truly are together." She was silent for so long that he feared he had overstepped. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted closer, until the space between them disappeared and her head rested lightly against his shoulder. "I would like that," she whispered. "Very much." Charles dared to wrap an arm around her, drawing her gently against him. She came willingly, fitting against him as though they had lain this way 1,000 times before, rather than the handful of dutiful encounters their marriage had previously contained. "Sleep," he murmured into her hair. "I'll keep watch." But it was Margaret who remained awake long after Charles's breathing had deepened into slumber, her mind turning over the extraordinary changes in her circumstances, in her understanding of herself, her past, and the man who slept beside her. For the first time since receiving the mysterious letter that had upended her world, she felt not just determination, but hope. Dawn broke with a light rain and a knock at their door. William Frost's daughter delivered breakfast and news. The Silver Maid would sail with the morning tide, less than an hour away. They prepared quickly, gathering their few possessions. Charles noticed Margaret lingering at the window, staring out at the harbor with an unreadable expression. "Second thoughts?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Not about our journey. But I was thinking about my mother, about the choices she made. She married my father for love, only to be forced into a loveless union with Crawford after losing him." Charles moved to stand beside her. "She must have been very brave." "She was." Margaret turned to face him. "She told me once that life rarely follows the path we expect, but courage lies in finding beauty along whichever path we walk." Wise advice. "Yes." Her eyes held his. "I wonder what she would think of the path I'm walking now." Charles took her hand, raising it to his lips. "I think she would be proud of your courage. As am I." Margaret's smile, small but genuine, warmed him more than the breakfast they had just shared. They descended to find Frost waiting, his massive frame somehow managing to appear inconspicuous as he guided them through the village to the harbor. The Silver Maid proved to be a sturdy fishing vessel, larger than most in the harbor, but still modest enough to avoid unwanted attention. Its captain, a weathered woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a severe braid, greeted them with brisk efficiency. "Captain Margaret Hall," she introduced herself, eyes twinkling slightly at Margaret's surprised expression. "Yes, we share a name, Your Grace. Perhaps it will bring good fortune to our voyage." "Let us hope so, Captain," Margaret replied warmly. And please, no titles aboard your ship. We're simply Mr. and Mrs. Ravenshire." "As you wish." The captain gestured toward the cabin. "It's not the luxury you're accustomed to, but it's clean and private." "It's perfect," Charles assured her, helping Margaret aboard. "We're grateful for your assistance." Captain Hall nodded once. "Any friend of Frost's is welcome aboard the Maid. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have a tide to catch." As they settled into the small cabin, the vessel already beginning to move beneath them, Margaret turned to Charles with sudden realization. "You never told me your mother's family were shipping merchants," she said. "In 5 years of marriage, I knew nothing of the Hargroves." Charles's expression grew contemplative. "My father discouraged mention of them. They weren't titled, you see, merely wealthy through trade. Yet you remembered your mother's connections when we needed them most. She used to tell me stories," he admitted, "of Maplewood, of the ships her family sailed, of the freedom she knew before becoming a duchess. I think she wanted me to understand that nobility isn't solely determined by title." Margaret touched his arm gently. "She would be proud of you, I think. The Duke who remembered he is also a man." Charles covered her hand with his own. "I'm beginning to believe the man is far more important than the Duke ever was." The ship moved steadily out of the harbor, the village of Maplewood receding behind them. Standing together at the small porthole, Charles and Margaret watched as one chapter of their journey ended and another began. "North to Scotland," Charles murmured. "North to truth. And perhaps," Margaret added softly, "to a new beginning for us both." The Silver Maid caught the wind, surging forward into the open sea. Behind them, the coastline of their past. Before them, the uncharted waters of their future. Together. The journey to Newcastle passed without incident, the Silver Maid living up to her reputation as one of the fastest vessels along the coast. Captain Hall proved to be not only an exceptional sailor, but also a discreet host, providing meals and privacy without unnecessary interaction. On their second night at sea, a storm blew in from the east, tossing the ship violently. Charles found Margaret on deck, face lifted to the stinging rain, her eyes alight with an exhilaration he had never witnessed in her before. "You should be below," he called over the wind, reaching for her arm. "Isn't it magnificent?" she replied, making no move to retreat. "So wild and free." In that moment, rain-soaked and wind-blown, she looked more alive than he had ever seen her in London's finest ballrooms. "You're magnificent," he said, the words torn from him with unexpected honesty. Margaret turned to him, her smile radiant in the storm's fury. "For the first time in years, I feel like myself. Not a duchess, not a daughter, not a wife. Just Margaret." Charles drew her close, not for protection, but for the simple pleasure of holding her. "I'm beginning to think I prefer Margaret to all her other titles." She laughed, the sound nearly lost in the gale, and to his astonishment, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a swift, impulsive kiss to his lips before pulling away. "Come," she said, taking his hand. "Even freedom-seekers shouldn't tempt pneumonia." They retreated to their cabin, soaked to the skin and laughing like children. Charles found himself staring at this transformed woman, this Margaret who laughed freely and kissed impulsively and stood fearless in the face of storms, both literal and figurative. Had she always been this woman, beneath the perfect Duchess exterior? Had he simply been too blind to see? The ship docked in Newcastle during a misty dawn, the harbor already bustling with commercial activity. Captain Hall bid them farewell, with a firm handshake and a sealed letter. "For Captain James Hargrove," she explained. "Your mother's nephew, I believe. He maintains a small shipping office near the customs house. He'll see you safely to Scotland." Charles accepted the letter with genuine gratitude. "We are in your debt, Captain." "No debt between friends of Maplewood," she replied briskly. "Fair winds to you both." They found the Hargrove shipping office easily enough, a modest establishment with an impeccably clean front room and a harried-looking clerk who nearly dropped his ledger when Charles introduced himself. "Mr. Ravenshire, sir." The young man scrambled to his feet. "Captain Hargrove mentioned you might call. Please follow me." He led them through a narrow hallway to a comfortable office where a man in his early 40s stood studying a large map on the wall. James Hargrove turned at their entrance, his features bearing a striking resemblance to Charles's mother. "So, Eleanor's son finally remembers his seafaring relatives," Hargrove said without preamble, though his eyes were kind. "And under interesting circumstances, from what I hear." Charles stepped forward, extending his hand. "Cousin, thank you for seeing us." Hargrove clasped it firmly. Family is family, titles or no titles. His gaze shifted to Margaret, and this must be the Duchess who's caused such a stir in London society. Margaret met his assessing look with quiet dignity. "I prefer Margaret, if you don't mind. The Duchess seems to have been left behind somewhere between London and Pemberton." A smile cracked Hargrove's weathered face. "Well said, Margaret. And well matched, cousin, if I may say so." He gestured toward the chairs before his desk. "Now, I understand you need discreet passage to Scotland." As they seated themselves, Charles noted the intelligence in his cousin's eyes. This was a man who understood the value of information and calculated risks. "Our destination is my hunting lodge near Inverness," Charles confirmed. "And yes, discretion is essential. We're being pursued by an influential man with considerable resources." "The Earl of Wexford," Hargrove stated, rather than asked. "News travels, cousin, even to mere shipping merchants. Half of London believes you've kidnapped your own wife in a fit of jealous madness." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. "And the other half? The other half believes you've both fallen victim to some tropical disease of the mind." Hargrove's expression turned serious. "Blackthorn has spun quite a tale. You're fortunate to have friends in less respectable circles." "Can you help us reach Inverness undetected?" Charles pressed. Hargrove nodded. "I have a merchant vessel leaving tonight for Edinburgh. From there, a trusted associate can arrange transportation north." He studied them both carefully. "But before I risk my ship and crew, I should know what makes the Earl of Wexford pursue you with such determination." Charles and Margaret exchanged glances. After a moment's silent communication, Charles nodded, and Margaret began their tale. From the mysterious letter she had received to the revelations about both their families to their current quest for evidence hidden in the Scottish lodge. Hargrove listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim. "I knew your mother had doubts about your father's death," he said, when they had finished. "She visited me just weeks before her own passing, asking questions about shipping records from 20 years ago, specifically voyages connected to William Blackwood and Thomas Crawford." "Did she find what she sought?" Margaret asked eagerly. "Not then, but perhaps you will." Hargrove rose and moved to a small safe concealed behind a landscape painting. "Eleanor left this with me, with instructions to keep it until either she returned or her son came asking the right questions." He unlocked the safe and withdrew a sealed packet, handing it to Charles. "I believe this contains the shipping records she was investigating. I never opened it." Charles accepted the package, the weight of it significant in more ways than one. "Why didn't you send this to me after her death?" "Your mother was quite specific," Hargrove replied. "She said you would come when the time was right, when you were ready to see beyond the ducal obligations that had consumed your father." A faint smile touched his lips. "She always was uncannily prescient, your mother." Charles stared at the packet, emotions warring within him. His mother had prepared for this moment, had anticipated he would someday question the circumstances of his father's death, would seek answers beyond the careful narrative Blackthorn had constructed. "She knew," he said softly. "All those years ago, she knew something was wrong." "Eleanor was nobody's fool," Hargrove confirmed. "Becoming a duchess didn't change that." Margaret placed a gentle hand on Charles's arm. "Perhaps we should examine the contents." With careful movements, Charles broke the seal and unfolded the papers within. Records of shipments, ownership certificates, correspondence between his father and William Blackwood, and most damning of all, a letter from his father to his mother, dated just days before his sudden death. "My dearest Eleanor, what I have discovered chills me to the bone. Blackthorn and Crawford have built their fortune on Blackwood's grave, but the man is not dead, as we were led to believe. I have proof he was imprisoned, not drowned, and that Blackthorne arranged the accident that supposedly claimed his life. More disturbing still, I believe they have done something to William's daughter, Crawford's supposed child. The girl shows none of Crawford's features, but bears a striking resemblance to Maria Blackwood. I fear the worst, that Crawford murdered William and forced his widow to marry him to gain control of the Blackwood fortune. I have prepared documents exposing everything. By the time you receive this, I will have confronted Blackthorne directly. If anything happens to me, seek out my solicitor, Mr. Daniels. He holds copies of all evidence. Protect our son. Blackthorne will seek to control him, and through him, access to our family's papers, which contain additional proof of their crimes. With eternal love, Edward's silence fell as they absorbed the implications of the letter. Charles felt a cold rage building within him. Rage at Blackthorne's betrayal, at the theft of his parents, at the years of manipulation. My father was murdered for discovering the truth, he said quietly, and my mother followed soon after. And then Blackthorne became your guardian, Margaret added, her voice equally soft, positioning himself to continue the deception, to ensure you would never find these documents. Hargrove's expression was solemn. What will you do with this knowledge? Charles carefully refolded the papers. First, we continue to Scotland. The hunting lodge contains additional evidence my father mentioned, duplicates of all important family papers. And then? Hargrove pressed. Then we destroy the man who destroyed our families, Margaret answered, her green eyes flashing with determination. We reclaim my father's legacy and clear your parents' names. Charles covered her hand with his own, drawing strength from her resolve. Precisely. Hargrove nodded, satisfied. My ship sails at midnight. Until then, rest. You're safe here. They were shown to a comfortable room above the shipping office, plain but clean. Once alone, Charles paced restlessly, the revelations from his father's letter churning within him. I've been a puppet, he said bitterly, dancing to Blackthorne's direction all these years, never suspecting he orchestrated my parents' deaths. Margaret moved to his side, placing a calming hand on his arm. You were a child when it happened. How could you have known? I should have questioned, should have investigated. Charles ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Instead, I became exactly what Blackthorne intended, a duke more concerned with propriety than truth. Charles. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Look at me. He turned to find her eyes clear and steady, a source of unexpected strength. We cannot change the past, she said simply, but we are changing our future, here and now. We're breaking free of their manipulations. We're choosing our own path. The truth of her words settled something within him. Charles reached for her, drawing her into his arms, not from passion, but from gratitude. When did you become so wise? He murmured against her hair. He felt her smile against his shoulder. Perhaps I always was. Perhaps you're only now learning to listen. Charles laughed softly. A fair assessment. They stood entwined for a long moment, finding comfort in each other's presence. When they finally separated, something had shifted between them. A deeper understanding, a truer partnership than their arranged marriage had ever provided. We should review the records, Margaret suggested, gesturing to the packet they had placed on a small table. There may be additional information that could help us. They spent the afternoon poring over shipping manifests, ownership certificates, and correspondence, piecing together the story of William Blackwood's presumed death and Crawford's subsequent takeover of his business interests. Look at this, Margaret said suddenly, indicating an entry in a manifest dated shortly after Blackwood's drowning. A shipment of medical supplies to a private estate in Scotland, paid for by Crawford but registered under Blackthorne's name. Charles frowned, examining the document. The destination is near our hunting lodge, within a day's ride at most. Their eyes met, the implication clear. If William Blackwood was imprisoned rather than drowned, Margaret said slowly, could that estate have been his prison? It's possible. Charles searched through the papers until he found a map of the area. The property appears to be isolated, surrounded by Blackthorne's hunting grounds. The perfect place to hide someone you wish to keep alive but contained. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "Do you think? Could my father possibly still be alive?" Charles covered her hands with his own. "After 20 years? It seems unlikely. But if he survived initially, there might be records, evidence that could further implicate Blackthorne and Crawford." She nodded, drawing a deep breath. "Of course. I shouldn't allow hope to cloud reason." "Hope is not our enemy," Charles said gently, "but we must prepare ourselves for whatever truth we find." They continued their research until dusk, when a knock at their door announced dinner. Hargrove joined them, providing additional context to some of the shipping records and confirming that the vessel to Edinburgh was prepared for their arrival. "You'll sail as Mr. and Mrs. Harper," he explained, handing them new identification papers. "Merchants from Newcastle seeking investment opportunities in Edinburgh. The captain knows only that you require discretion, not your true identities." "Your thoroughness is appreciated," Charles said sincerely. Hargrove waved away his thanks. Eleanor would expect nothing less for her son. His expression softened slightly. "She would have liked you, Margaret. She had little patience for society's artificial constraints on women of intelligence." "I wish I could have known her," Margaret replied with equal sincerity. "In some ways, you remind me of her," Hargrove observed. "The same quiet strength, the same ability to adapt to circumstances without surrendering dignity." Charles looked between them, struck by the comparison he had never before considered. Yet it rang true. His mother and his wife shared a core of resilience beneath their socially acceptable exteriors. How much he had missed by accepting appearances, by never looking deeper. At midnight, they made their way to the docks, Hargrove personally escorting them to ensure their safe passage. The merchant vessel, the Northern Star, waited with minimal crew visible, another precaution for which Charles was grateful. "This is where we part ways, cousin," Hargrove said as they prepared to board. "The captain has instructions to deliver you safely to my associate in Edinburgh. From there, you'll be guided north." Charles clasped his hand firmly. "We owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Hargrove shook his head. "Family stands together. Eleanor taught me that. Honor her memory by reclaiming the truth she sought." "We will," Margaret promised, impulsively embracing the surprised shipping merchant. "Thank you for everything." As they boarded the Northern Star, Charles glanced back at his cousin's diminishing figure on the dock. Another connection to a past he had never fully understood. Another thread in the complex tapestry of his true heritage. "Your mother would be proud," Margaret said softly, following his gaze. Charles turned to her. This woman who had become not just his wife but his partner in their dangerous quest. "Of both of us, I think." The ship slipped silently from the harbor, carrying them northward toward Scotland, toward evidence that could destroy an earl, restore a legacy, and perhaps give birth to a marriage of substance rather than appearance. Charles drew Margaret close as they stood at the rail, watching Newcastle recede into darkness. "Whatever awaits us," he murmured, "we face it together." She leaned into him, her quiet strength a bulwark against uncertainty. "Together," she agreed, "as we should have been from the beginning." The Northern Star caught the wind, surging forward into the night. Behind them lay the shattered remnants of the life they had known. Ahead, the promise of truth, and perhaps redemption. Edinburgh greeted them with a persistent Scottish drizzle and fog that clung to the ancient buildings like ghostly shrouds. The Northern Star docked in Leith, where Hargrove's associate, a taciturn Highlander named Malcolm Fraser, awaited with a closed carriage and minimal questions. "The roads north are watched," he informed them as they settled into the vehicle. "But I know paths the English lords have never trod." True to his word, Fraser led them on a circuitous journey that avoided main thoroughfares, winding instead through small villages and across moorlands where ancient stones stood sentinel against the misty landscape. During one particularly difficult stretch, when their carriage could proceed no further, Fraser produced sturdy horses for the mountain passage. Charles watched with mingled pride and concern as Margaret mounted her steed with unexpected confidence. "Another skill I didn't know you possessed," he remarked as they navigated a narrow trail. She smiled, rain glistening on her cheeks. Crawford insisted I learn, though he considered it merely an aristocratic accomplishment. Little did he know I would one day ride to uncover his crimes. You ride as though born to it. Perhaps I was. Her expression turned thoughtful. I wonder how many of my preferences and abilities come from the father I never knew. The man who loved the sea, who built ships, who apparently valued courage over convention. Charles considered this. Nature or nurture, an eternal question. But I believe we choose who we become, regardless of parentage. Is that what you're doing now? She asked. Choosing a different path than the one laid out for the Duke of Ravenshire? I'm choosing to be worthy of the woman who rides beside me, he replied simply. The rest will follow. The journey to Inverness took 4 days, each night spent in modest inns or, when necessary, shepherds' huts, where Fraser had arranged discreet lodgings. Throughout, Charles marveled at Margaret's resilience, her ability to sleep on straw pallets without complaint, to eat simple fare with genuine appreciation, to endure long hours of travel without losing her composure. Had she always possessed this strength? Or had their adventure revealed qualities long suppressed by society's expectations? On the 5th morning, as they crested a final hill, Fraser pointed toward a distant structure nestled among pine trees. Ravenshire Lodge, he announced. Built by your grandfather during the Jacobite troubles as a refuge, should London become unfriendly to those with Highland connections. Charles nodded. Memories of childhood summers spent exploring the surrounding forests, returning with unexpected clarity. I haven't visited in years, not since before my father's death. The caretaker maintains it, Fraser assured him. Old McTavish, loyal to your family for 3 generations. Can he be trusted with our current situation? Margaret asked, practical as always. With your life, Fraser confirmed. McTavish despises Blackthorn, has his reasons. Charles raised an eyebrow, but Fraser merely shrugged, offering no further explanation. Some Scottish feuds, it seemed, required no elaboration. They approached the lodge cautiously, alert for any sign of surveillance. The sturdy stone building appeared peaceful, smoke curling from one of 3 chimneys, windows shuttered against the persistent Highland mist. Fraser dismounted first, whistling a distinct pattern. After a moment, the heavy wooden door opened to reveal a white-haired man of indeterminate age, his weathered face creasing into a smile of recognition. Young Ravenshire, he called in a thick brogue. About time you returned to your ancestral soil. Charles dismounted, helping Margaret down before approaching the old caretaker. McTavish, it's good to see you well. Better than some, worse than others. McTavish's sharp eyes moved to Margaret, assessing her with unexpected deference. And this would be your Duchess. Margaret, she corrected gently, extending her hand. McTavish took it briefly, his weathered fingers gentle despite their appearance. Aye, you've a look of your mother about you. Margaret started. You knew my mother? Maria Blackwood? McTavish nodded. She visited once with your true father, before Crawford's treachery. A kind woman with eyes that miss nothing, much like yours, I'd wager. Charles watched his wife absorb this unexpected connection to her past, emotion flashing briefly across her face before she composed herself. I would very much like to hear about that visit, when time permits, she said carefully. McTavish nodded. Time we have, though perhaps not in abundance. Come inside, both of you. These hills have eyes even in the mist. The interior of Ravenshire Lodge was exactly as Charles remembered. Rustic but comfortable, with massive stone fireplaces and sturdy furniture built to withstand both harsh Highland winters and the passage of generations. I've prepared the master chambers, McTavish informed them, as Fraser departed with promises to return in a fortnight, and taken the liberty of laying out some suitable clothing. Your London finery would raise questions in these parts. Indeed, Charles discovered well-worn but quality garments awaiting in the bedroom, practical Highland attire that would allow him to blend with local gentry without drawing undue attention. For Margaret, simpler gowns than her usual Duchess wardrobe, but still befitting a gentleman's wife. How did you know to expect us? Charles asked, as they gathered in the main hall after refreshing themselves. McTavish's expression turned grave. "A letter came 3 weeks ago from your mother's cousin in Newcastle. Said you might arrive seeking certain family papers. Said if you came, danger followed close behind. Hargrove gave no indication he had warned you," Margaret noted with surprise. "Prudent man." McTavish poured 3 glasses of whiskey, offering them with ceremonial gravity. "The fewer who knew of your plans, the better." Charles accepted the whiskey, its peaty aroma a sensory memory from childhood visits. "We need access to my father's private vault. The papers stored there may prove crucial to exposing a conspiracy that claimed both our families." McTavish nodded sagely. The old Duke was a cautious man. Built the vault himself, with only McTavish hands to help. No Sassenach architect to draw plans that might fall into unwanted eyes. "Can you show us?" Margaret asked. "Aye, lass. But first, drink. The journey's been long, and the papers have waited many years. They'll wait another hour while you restore yourselves." The old caretaker's wisdom was undeniable. They settled by the fire, sipping the excellent whiskey, while McTavish prepared a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and freshly baked bread. Only when they had eaten and truly rested did he lead them to the Duke's study, a modest room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. "The entrance is hidden, of course," McTavish explained, moving to the large stone fireplace. His gnarled fingers found invisible catches in the elaborate carving of the mantel. "A mechanism your grandfather designed. Clever man, for all his fancy English education." With a soft click, a section of the stone hearth swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. McTavish lit an oil lamp and handed it to Charles. "The vault is at the bottom, 23 steps exactly. Mind your footing. The stone can be slippery." Charles turned to Margaret. "Perhaps you should wait here." She raised an eyebrow, the expression so reminiscent of their earlier relationship that he almost smiled despite the gravity of the moment. "I've come too far to wait at the threshold, Charles. We do this together, remember?" McTavish chuckled. "She's right, lad. Some burdens are lighter when shared." Charles conceded with a nod, leading the way down the narrow stairs, Margaret following closely. The air grew cooler as they descended, heavy with the scent of stone and earth and secrets long kept. At the bottom, they found a small chamber with walls of fitted stone and a single iron door. A complex lock mechanism gleamed in the lamplight. "My father showed me the combination once," Charles murmured, studying the device. "When I was perhaps 12. I never imagined I would need to remember it." Margaret touched his arm gently. "Close your eyes. Sometimes memories surface more easily when we're not straining to recall them." Charles followed her suggestion, allowing his mind to drift back to that childhood visit. His father's hand on his shoulder, the serious tone as he explained the importance of family legacy, the careful demonstration of the lock's sequence. 3 turns right to my birth year," he recited slowly. 1 turn left to your mother's. 2 turns right to the year we wed. 1 final turn left to your birth year. His fingers moved almost of their own accord, following the remembered instructions. The mechanism responded with a series of satisfying clicks, and the door swung open with surprising ease for its apparent weight. The vault itself was small, but meticulously organized. Metal boxes lined shelves along 3 walls, each labeled in his father's precise handwriting. In the center stood a small table with a ledger open upon it, a catalog of the vault's contents. "He was nothing if not methodical," Charles observed, lifting the ledger, "even in preserving evidence against his closest friend." Margaret moved to the shelves, examining the labels. Here, Blackwood Crawford Partnership, 1810-1812. This must contain the original agreements. Charles joined her, selecting the box and placing it on the table. Inside, they found exactly what they sought: the founding documents of the shipping venture between William Blackwood and Thomas Crawford, with his father as legal witness to the arrangement. Most significantly, they discovered the original will of William Blackwood, designating his wife Maria and infant daughter Margaret as sole heirs to his considerable fortune. with specific provisions should anything happen to him before Margaret reached majority. Crawford had no legal claim to any of it, Margaret said softly, tracing her real father's signature with a trembling finger. Everything he presented as my dowry was actually my inheritance, stolen from me. Charles continued searching, locating a second box labeled Blackwood Disappearance, Evidence and Correspondence. Within lay his father's meticulous documentation of inconsistencies in the official report of William Blackwood's death, including sworn statements from sailors who claimed the accident had been carefully orchestrated. Most damning of all was a letter from a physician who had treated a special patient at Blackthorn's Scottish estate, a man with injuries consistent with attempted murder rather than a shipwreck, a man kept sedated and isolated for months before being moved to an undisclosed location. They kept him alive initially, Charles said grimly, perhaps to force him to sign documents transferring his assets to Crawford. And when he refused, Margaret could barely form the question. Charles shook his head. The physician's letters end abruptly. He either stopped reporting or was silenced, Margaret finished, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Like so many others who stood between Crawford and Blackthorn and their ambitions, they continued their methodical examination of the vault's contents, discovering ever more evidence of the conspiracy. Financial records showing massive transfers from Blackwood's accounts to Crawford's following the accident, correspondence between Blackthorn and Crawford discussing their arrangement, and most chilling, detailed instructions from Blackthorn to the physician regarding the management of their special patient. My father was gathering a case, Charles realized, surveying the extensive documentation, not just suspicions or theories, concrete evidence that would have destroyed both men in any court in England. Evidence that died with him, Margaret said softly. Until now. A sound from above startled them both, footsteps crossing the study floor, too heavy to belong to the aged McTavish. Charles quickly gathered the most crucial documents, stuffing them into his coat. Someone's come. We need to... The unmistakable report of a pistol cut him off, followed by a heavy thud and a pained groan that could only have come from McTavish. Margaret's eyes widened in alarm. They've found us. The old passage, Charles whispered urgently. My father mentioned an escape tunnel leading from the vault to the forest. There must be. His searching hands found a depression in the stone wall behind the table. Pressing firmly, he triggered a mechanism that revealed a narrow opening barely large enough for one person to squeeze through. You first, he insisted, helping Margaret toward the hidden passage. She resisted. Not without you. I'm right behind you. Charles pressed the crucial documents into her hands. These must reach safety, even if we don't. Go, please. The approaching footsteps grew louder. With a final, anguished look, Margaret slipped into the passage. Charles followed immediately, pulling the hidden door closed behind them, just as lamplight flooded the vault. The tunnel was narrow and damp, forcing them to move in single file, bent almost double in places. Charles kept one hand on Margaret's back, guiding her forward when the path branched or descended unexpectedly. After what seemed an eternity, they emerged into the misty twilight of the Highland forest, the lodge now distant behind them. Without pausing to rest, Charles led Margaret deeper into the woods, following game trails that would hide their tracks from all but the most experienced trackers. Only when they had put considerable distance between themselves and the lodge did they stop, sheltering beneath a massive oak as darkness fell completely. McTavish, Margaret said, her voice tight with concern. Do you think... He's alive, Charles asserted, hoping his confidence wasn't misplaced. Blackthorn needs information more than he needs another death to explain. They'll question him. He won't betray us, Margaret said with certainty. I could see it in his eyes. He's a man of absolute loyalty. Let us hope so. Charles surveyed their surroundings. We need shelter for the night. There's a shepherd's bothy about 2 miles from here, if I remember correctly. We can reach it before the weather worsens. Margaret nodded, gathering her skirts to continue their journey. In the fading light, with her hair escaping its pins and determination etched on her features, She looked nothing like the perfect Duchess of London society, and infinitely more magnificent. "You're staring again," she noted, though her tone held warmth rather than reproach. "I'm seeing you," he replied simply, perhaps for the first time. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a vulnerability quickly masked by practical resolve. "We should move while we still have some light." The bothy proved to be little more than a stone hut with a dirt floor and crude fireplace, but it offered shelter from the increasingly heavy rain. Charles managed to start a small fire while Margaret sorted through the documents they had salvaged from the vault. "We have enough," she said finally. "Enough to prove the conspiracy, to expose Blackthorn, to reclaim my inheritance, and clear both our families' names. If we can get these papers to London," Charles reminded her. "To my father's solicitor, who can present them to proper authorities. And avoid being captured or killed in the process." Margaret's practical nature reasserted itself. A simple task, really. Despite everything, Charles found himself laughing, a genuine, unexpected sound in their dire circumstances. After a startled moment, Margaret joined him, the tension of their escape finding release in shared mirth. "We've become quite the adventurous couple," he observed when their laughter subsided. "A far cry from the Duke and Duchess of Ravensshire, who could barely manage conversation over breakfast." "I rather prefer this version of us," Margaret admitted, "though perhaps with less mortal danger in future." An excellent amendment. Charles moved to sit beside her, drawn by some magnetic pull he could no longer resist. "When this is over, when we've reclaimed our lives and legacies, what then? Do we return to our proper ducal existence?" Margaret considered his question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't think we can. Not as we were before. Too much has changed." "We've changed," he corrected gently. "Yes." Her eyes met his, firelight reflecting in their green depths. "I've discovered a woman I never knew existed beneath the perfect Duchess exterior. A woman I rather like." "I more than like her," Charles said softly. "I admire her courage, her resilience, her remarkable ability to adapt to circumstances that would break most women of her station. And I've discovered a man beneath the ducal facade," Margaret continued. "A man of principle and surprising resourcefulness. A man I might have chosen, had choice been mine." The admission hung between them, fragile and precious. Charles reached out, tracing the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "Perhaps we can choose now," he suggested. "Not as Duke and Duchess, but as Charles and Margaret." Something luminous bloomed in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or a deeper emotion neither had dared acknowledge during their years of polite detachment. "I would like that," she whispered. This time, when Charles leaned forward to kiss her, there was nothing dutiful or prescribed in the gesture. It was a true beginning, a choice made not from arrangement or obligation, but from genuine feeling that had grown amid danger and discovery. Margaret responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as though she had waited years for precisely this moment. Perhaps she had. Perhaps they both had, trapped in the gilded cage of their arranged marriage, never daring to seek the connection that might have been theirs all along. When they finally separated, breathless and flushed, Charles rested his forehead against hers. "If someone had told me a month ago that I would be hiding in a shepherd's hut in the Highlands, pursued by assassins, and falling in love with my own wife, I would have questioned their sanity." "Falling in love?" Margaret repeated, the words careful, hopeful. "Desperately," Charles confirmed. "Inconveniently, completely." Her smile was radiant, transforming her face in the firelight. "How fortunate that I find myself in precisely the same condition." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the stone roof of their humble shelter. Inside, something new and precious blossomed between them, a love born not of arrangement, but of shared danger, mutual respect, and the discovery of the true individuals beneath their social masks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for tonight, in this humble shelter far from the glittering ballrooms of London, they had found something far more valuable than titles or fortunes. They had found each other. Dawn broke with reluctant gray light filtering through the bothy's single window. Charles woke first, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before the events of the previous day rushed back. Margaret slept beside him on their makeshift bed of heather and cloaks, her face peaceful in repose, one hand curled protectively around the precious documents they had salvaged. He watched her for a moment, struck by how completely his feelings for her had transformed. The arranged marriage that had once seemed a mere social obligation now felt like the greatest fortune of his life, though certainly not in the way either of their families had intended. Margaret stirred, her eyes opening to find him watching her. A smile touched her lips, unguarded and genuine. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "Indeed it is," he replied, dropping a light kiss on her forehead, "though our accommodations leave something to be desired." She chuckled, sitting up to survey their rustic shelter. "I've developed a new appreciation for our London home, though I find the company here far superior." Charles rose, moving to rekindle their fire from the night's embers. "We need to plan our next move. Blackthorn's men will be searching the area." Margaret nodded, immediately focused on their precarious situation. "We need to get these documents to London, to someone with authority who can't be bought or intimidated by Blackthorn." "My father's solicitor, Mr. Daniels," Charles confirmed. "But we can't risk traveling directly. Blackthorn will have men watching every road, every coaching in." "What about your cousin's shipping connections? Could we return to Newcastle and sail from there?" Charles considered this as he coaxed the fire to life. "Possibly, but I hesitate to involve Hargrove further. Blackthorn will have connected him to our escape by now." Margaret began carefully repacking the documents inside her bodice, the safest hiding place available. "Then we need another ally. Someone Blackthorn wouldn't suspect." A sudden thought struck Charles. "Not suspect, no, but perhaps someone he believes is already his." "Who?" "Lady Danbury." Charles's expression turned thoughtful. "My godmother, Blackthorn's sister-in-law. She's been a fixture in London society for 30 years, knows everyone's secrets, and has never shown particular affection for her brother-in-law." Margaret looked skeptical. "Can she be trusted with something of this magnitude?" "She was my mother's closest friend," Charles explained, "and she has her own reasons to distrust Blackthorn. He controlled her inheritance after her husband died, released it only when she threatened some unspecified scandal." "She has influence, certainly," Margaret acknowledged. "But how do we reach her without exposing ourselves?" Charles smiled slowly. "We don't reach her. We arrange for her to find us." Lady Agnes Danbury's Scottish estate sat just 15 miles from their current position, a fact Charles had remembered during their night in the bothy. A formidable widow with connections throughout Britain's highest circles, Lady Danbury spent every autumn in Scotland, ostensibly for the bracing air, but more likely, as society whispered, to entertain gentlemen companions away from London's prying eyes. "She hosts a hunting party this time every year," Charles explained, as they made their way cautiously through the Highland forest. "Blackthorn knows this, but would never suspect we'd seek her out. Their mutual dislike is too well established." "Yet you believe she'll help us?" Margaret asked, picking her way over a fallen log with surprising agility for a woman raised in drawing rooms and ballrooms. "She keeps a locket with my mother's miniature," Charles said softly. 30 years after they made their debut together. That kind of loyalty doesn't fade. They traveled all day, avoiding roads and villages, keeping to the forests and low valleys where the persistent Scottish mist provided additional cover. By late afternoon, they caught sight of Danbury Lodge, smaller than Ravenshire's hunting seat, but elegantly situated overlooking a picturesque loch. "How do we approach?" Margaret asked as they observed the property from a wooded hillside. "We can hardly present ourselves at the front door among her guests." "The gamekeeper's cottage," Charles indicated a small stone building at the edge of the estate. "Callum MacGregor. He was gamekeeper when I visited as a boy. If he still serves Lady Danbury, he'll remember me." Twilight provided cover as they approached the cottage. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed behind drawn curtains. Charles knocked softly, prepared for either welcome or rejection. The door opened to reveal a robust man in his 60s, white-haired but straight-backed, with the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. Recognition dawned slowly in his eyes. "Young Ravenshire?" he asked incredulously. "Saints preserve us." "MacGregor." Charles nodded respectfully. "We need your help." The gamekeeper's gaze shifted to Margaret, noting her disheveled appearance and travel-worn clothes. Without further questions, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Inside, quickly. These hills have more eyes than heather blooms." Once inside the cozy cottage, they explained their situation in careful detail: the conspiracy, the evidence, their need to reach Lady Danbury without Blackthorn's knowledge. MacGregor listened gravely, his lined face growing increasingly troubled. When they finished, he rose without a word and retrieved a bottle of whiskey from a cupboard, pouring 3 generous measures. "I knew the old Duke, your father," he said to Charles after they had all drunk. "A good man, honest. Lady Danbury mourned him almost as much as your mother did." "Will she help us?" Margaret asked directly. MacGregor studied her with newfound respect. "Aye, my lady. If half of what you've said is true, she'll move heaven and earth to see justice done. She has no love for Blackthorn, and less for any who harm those she holds dear." "Can you arrange a meeting?" Charles pressed. "Tonight, if possible. We dare not linger." "She dines with her guests until 10, MacGregor said, considering. "After, she always takes a brandy in her private study. I'll bring you through the servants' entrance at 10:30. Her lady's maid, Martha, is my niece. She'll ensure no one else is about." Relief flooded Charles. "Thank you, MacGregor. We won't forget this." The gamekeeper waved away his gratitude. "No thanks needed for doing what's right, Your Grace. Now let's see about getting you both something to eat and some proper clothes. Can't have you meeting Lady Danbury looking like you've been dragged through the Highlands by wild horses." "We very nearly were," Margaret said with unexpected humor. MacGregor's weathered face creased in a smile. "Aye, my lady, I can see that. But if you'll permit an old man's observation, it seems to have agreed with you." By 10:30, both Charles and Margaret had been fed, clothed in garments borrowed from MacGregor's niece and nephew, and briefed on the precise route through the servants' quarters to Lady Danbury's private study. The gamekeeper led them silently through the darkened grounds, using paths hidden from the main house's windows. Martha, a practical-looking woman in her 40s, met them at the servants' entrance, her expression betraying no surprise at receiving clandestine visitors. "Her ladyship is alone," she whispered, leading them through back corridors designed to allow servants to move invisibly throughout the grand house. "The gentlemen are at billiards, the ladies at cards. No one will disturb her for at least an hour." Charles felt Margaret's hand slip into his as they approached the study door. He squeezed it reassuringly, drawing strength from her presence as much as offering his own support. Martha knocked softly, then opened the door without waiting for a response. "Visitors, my lady," she announced simply, then stepped aside to allow them entry. Lady Agnes Danbury sat before a cheery fire, a brandy snifter in one elegantly wrinkled hand and a book in the other. At 65, she remained a handsome woman, her silver hair arranged fashionably, her posture impeccable even in private. She looked up, spectacles perched on the end of her aristocratic nose, and froze. The book slipped from her fingers. "Charles?" she said incredulously, rising to her feet. "My God, the entire country is searching for you." "With good reason," he replied, stepping forward to kiss her offered cheek. "Though not for the reasons Blackthorn has circulated." Lady Danbury's sharp eyes moved to Margaret. "And this must be your Duchess, the one you've supposedly driven to madness and abducted." Margaret curtsied perfectly, ducal training evident even in borrowed clothes. "Lady Danbury, I assure you my presence here is entirely voluntary." A smile touched the older woman's lips. "I should certainly hope so. Charles always was too proper for anything truly scandalous." She gestured toward chairs near the fire. "Sit, both of you. Martha, bring tea and ensure we're not disturbed." Once they were settled, Charles began their tale, starting with Margaret's mysterious letter and continuing through their discoveries about both their families. Lady Danbury listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When he mentioned his parents' deaths, something flashed in her eyes, a grief still raw after all these years. "Eleanor suspected," she said softly when he paused. "She came to me, just weeks before her own passing, with questions about Blackthorn's business dealings. I had no answers then." Her mouth tightened. "I should have pressed further. Perhaps if I had—" "Ma, you couldn't have known," Margaret said gently. "They were careful to isolate their victims, to make each death appear natural or accidental." Lady Danbury studied her with new appreciation. "You have your mother's insight, my dear. Maria Blackwood saw clearly when others were blinded by social niceties." Margaret straightened slightly. "You knew my mother as well?" "Before her marriage to Crawford, yes. She was some years younger than Eleanor and I, but notable for her intelligence and quiet strength." Lady Danbury's expression softened with memory. When she reappeared as Crawford's wife, something essential had changed in her. A light extinguished. "Now I understand why." Charles produced the documents they had salvaged from the vault. "We have proof of everything. My father's records, the original partnership agreements, evidence of Crawford and Blackthorn's conspiracy." Lady Danbury examined the papers carefully, her expression hardening as she absorbed their contents. When she looked up, her eyes blazed with righteous anger. "Reginald has much to answer for," she said, using Blackthorn's Christian name for the first time. "More than you know." "What do you mean?" Charles asked. Lady Danbury rose, moving to a small escritoire in the corner of the room. From a hidden compartment, she withdrew a sealed letter, yellowed with age. "Your mother entrusted this to me before her death. She made me swear I would deliver it to you only if you ever questioned the circumstances of your parents' passing." She held out the letter. "I believe the time has come." With slightly trembling fingers, Charles broke the seal, unfolding the delicate paper to reveal his mother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest son, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have begun to uncover the truth your father died to protect. Blackthorn is not who he claims to be. He and Crawford have built their fortunes through treachery and murder, beginning with William Blackwood and extending to your father when he discovered their crimes. I have reason to believe they have poisoned me as well, through small doses administered by a maid in Blackthorn's employ. By the time you receive this, it will be too late for me, but perhaps not too late for justice. Trust no one who aligns with Blackthorn. Seek out James Hargrove in Newcastle, my cousin who maintains our family's shipping connections. And when the time is right, share what you know with Agnes Danbury, who has been my truest friend and confidant. Most importantly, protect yourself and any family you may have. Blackthorn will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens his position or exposes his past. With eternal love, your mother Charles passed the letter to Margaret, unable to speak through the emotion constricting his throat. She read it quickly, her face paling at the confirmation of what they had already suspected. She knew, Margaret said softly. She knew they were killing her. Eleanor was never a fool, Lady Danbury confirmed, her own voice tight with suppressed emotion. She began keeping samples of everything she ate and drank in the weeks before her death. I sent them to a physician in Edinburgh after she passed, but by then, Blackthorn had already established himself as your guardian. I had no proof to challenge him. And now? Charles asked, finding his voice at last. Will you help us bring him to justice? Lady Danbury's spine straightened, aristocratic resolve hardening her features. My late husband's brother has evaded consequences for too long. Yes, Charles, I will help you. More than that, I will lead the charge. She rose, suddenly energized with purpose. My annual autumn house party provides the perfect cover. Among my current guests is Lord Chief Justice Harrington, no great friend to Blackthorn and a man of impeccable integrity. Also present is the Duke of Richmond, whose influence with the Prince Regent remains unmatched. You would bring them into our confidence? Margaret asked, caution evident in her tone. Not immediately, Lady Danbury clarified. First, we must secure these documents in multiple safe locations. Then we prepare our strategy. Blackthorn is powerful, with allies throughout London society and government. We must be certain of our ground before moving against him. Charles nodded, appreciating her tactical approach. What do you propose? Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, Martha will help Margaret transform her appearance, hair color, style of dress, perhaps even a subtle change to her natural speaking voice. You, Charles, will require similar alterations. Disguises? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Precisely. Lady Danbury smiled thinly. You will join my house party as my distant cousins from Edinburgh. The MacGregors, perhaps, recently returned from abroad and seeking quiet society after years in foreign climes. Blackthorne knows your guest list, Charles pointed out. Blackthorne knows what I allow him to know, Lady Danbury corrected, with the confidence of a woman who had navigated society's treacherous waters for decades. Last-minute additions to country house parties are commonplace, especially when they arrive with acceptable introductions and appropriate manners. Margaret exchanged a glance with Charles, silently communicating her thoughts. He nodded slightly, trusting her judgment as he had come to do throughout their journey. It could work, she acknowledged. But we would need to be convincing in our roles. From what I've observed this evening, my dear, you are both remarkably adaptable, Lady Danbury noted with approval. The perfect Duchess has discovered her inner adventuress, and the proper Duke has embraced his more resourceful heritage. Charles couldn't help but smile at her accurate assessment. We've had little choice but to adapt. Sometimes necessity reveals our truest selves, Lady Danbury observed. Now, Martha will show you to private quarters in the East Wing. It's currently unoccupied and can be accessed through the servants' passages. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we begin your transformation into the MacGregors of Edinburgh. As they followed Martha through the silent corridors of Danbury Lodge, Charles found himself marveling at how completely their circumstances had changed in a matter of hours. From fugitives in a shepherd's bothy to conspirators in a countess's mansion, their journey continued to defy all expectations. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked softly, as Martha left them in a comfortable suite far from the house's main guest rooms. "That we've found an unexpected ally," Charles replied, "and that perhaps, for the first time since this began, we have a real chance of exposing Blackthorne's crimes." Margaret moved to stand before him, her eyes searching his face. "And after? If we succeed?" Charles understood the question beneath her words. Were the feelings that had developed between them during their flight merely the product of danger and proximity? Would they endure once they returned to normal society, if such a return was even possible? "After," he said, drawing her gently into his arms, "we begin the life we should have had from the start. Not as the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire fulfilling an arrangement, but as Charles and Margaret building something real together." The smile that illuminated her face was worth every danger they had faced, every comfort they had sacrificed. "I would like that very much," she whispered, echoing words she had spoken days ago in a fisherman's cottage, a lifetime ago it seemed. As he bent to kiss her, Charles marveled at how thoroughly this adventure had transformed them both. The perfect Duchess and the proper Duke had disappeared somewhere between London and the Scottish Highlands. In their place stood two people who had discovered not just a conspiracy that had shaped their lives, but a love that would define their future. The transformation was remarkable. When Charles entered Lady Danbury's private sitting room the following afternoon, he barely recognized the woman standing by the window. Margaret's dark hair had been lightened to a warm auburn and styled in a fashion more typical of Edinburgh society than London's elite. Her borrowed gown, while well-made, lacked the distinctive elegance of a duchess's wardrobe, and she held herself with a slightly different posture, less regal, more approachable. "Mrs. MacGregor, I presume," he said, smiling as she turned to face him. Margaret's eyes widened slightly at his own altered appearance. His typically clean-shaven face now sported modest side whiskers. His dark hair had been subtly streaked with premature gray at the temples, and gold-rimmed spectacles changed the entire character of his countenance. "Mr. MacGregor," she replied with a perfect Edinburgh lilt to her voice. "How fortunate we were to receive Lady Danbury's invitation." Most fortunate indeed. Charles adopted the same regional accent with surprising ease. His mother had maintained connections to her Scottish roots, and childhood summers spent with Edinburgh cousins had left their mark on his linguistic capabilities. Lady Danbury entered, surveying them both with critical approval. "Excellent! Even I might pass you in a hallway without immediate recognition." "Will it be enough?" Margaret asked practically. "Blackthorne knows us both well." "Blackthorne sees what he expects to see," Lady Danbury replied. "And he certainly doesn't expect to find the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire hiding in plain sight at his sister-in-law's house party." She settled into a chair, gesturing for them to join her. "Now, I've taken the liberty of establishing your background. James and Margaret MacGregor recently returned from 5 years in Italy, where James managed shipping interest for an Edinburgh merchant house. Distant cousins of mine through my mother's family, distant enough that no one will question why they've never heard of you before." "And our purpose here?" Charles asked. "Considering a property in the area, seeking quiet society after the bustle of Florence. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would draw particular attention." Lady Danbury smiled slightly. "The most effective disguises are those that invite polite disinterest rather than curiosity." "When do we meet your other guests?" Margaret inquired. "Tonight at dinner. I've already mentioned your arrival to several key individuals, including Lord Chief Justice Harrington. He expressed appropriate but minimal interest, exactly as we would wish." Lady Danbury leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. "Now, as to the documents you recovered. I've had copies made by my most trusted secretary. The originals remain in my personal safe, but duplicates will be distributed to 3 separate locations." "A wise precaution," Charles acknowledged. "Indeed. One set goes to my solicitor in Edinburgh, another to a banker in London who has no connection to Blackthorne. The third—" she hesitated momentarily. "The third goes to Lord Harrington himself, though he will not know its significance until we choose to reveal it." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Is that not dangerous, giving evidence to someone who doesn't know its importance?" "On the contrary," Lady Danbury explained. "Harrington will receive what appears to be routine legal documents regarding a property dispute, buried within which are the most damning pieces of evidence against Blackthorne. Should anything happen to us, instructions will be sent to him explaining where to look and what to find." Charles nodded appreciatively. "Ensuring the evidence survives even if we do not." "Clever. I didn't navigate 40 years of London society by being anything less," Lady Danbury replied dryly. "Now, let us discuss tonight's strategy. You will be introduced simply as distant connections. Be pleasant, but not memorable. Observe everything, particularly Blackthorne's allies among my guests." "Blackthorne himself isn't here, I presume?" Margaret asked. "No. He and I maintain a carefully choreographed distance in social settings. But his eyes and ears certainly are. Lord Pembroke arrived yesterday, and he reports everything directly to Blackthorne." Charles frowned. "Pembroke was at our wedding. He knows us both." "Indeed, which is why your performances tonight must be impeccable." Lady Danbury's gaze was steady. "Are you prepared for this? To maintain your disguises even under close scrutiny?" Margaret straightened, green eyes flashing with determination. "After everything we've endured to reach this point? A dinner party seems a modest challenge." Charles couldn't help but smile at her confidence. "What my wife, forgive me, what Mrs. MacGregor says. We are more than equal to the task." "Excellent." Lady Danbury rose. "Rest this afternoon. Prepare your characters. Dinner is served at 7 precisely." The Danbury Lodge dining room glowed with candlelight as 16 guests gathered for the evening meal. Charles and Margaret entered separately, as Lady Danbury had advised, he escorting an elderly baroness, Margaret on the arm of a retired naval officer. The introductions passed without incident. Lord Pembroke barely glanced at the unremarkable MacGregors from Edinburgh, his attention focused on more illustrious guests. Lord Chief Justice Harrington, a distinguished man in his 60s, offered them a polite welcome before returning to his conversation with the Duke of Richmond. Seated at opposite ends of the table, Charles and Margaret played their roles perfectly. He discussing Italian shipping practices with reasonable knowledge, she sharing observations about Florence's architectural wonders with just enough detail to be convincing without drawing undue attention. Only once did Charles feel a moment of concern, when Pembroke suddenly looked at Margaret with narrowed eyes during a lull in conversation. "Have we met before, Mrs. McGregor?" he asked directly. "There's something familiar about your profile." Margaret turned to him with a pleasantly bland smile, her Edinburgh accent flawless. "I don't believe so, my lord. Unless you frequently visit Florence? We've been abroad these past 5 years." "No, not Florence." Pembroke continued to study her. "Perhaps Edinburgh, then. I occasionally visit for the hunting." "Ah, then that explains it," Margaret replied smoothly. "Edinburgh is quite small in social circles. We likely attended the same gathering at some point, though I confess I don't recall the specific occasion." Her response was perfect, acknowledging the possibility while redirecting attention away from detailed examination of her features. Pembroke nodded, satisfied, and returned to his discussion with Lady Harrington. Charles caught Lady Danbury's approving glance from the head of the table. The first test had been passed successfully. After dinner, the party divided as was customary, gentlemen to brandy and cigars, ladies to the drawing room for tea and gossip. Charles found himself seated near Lord Harrington, who surprised him by initiating conversation. "Lady Danbury tells me you've been managing shipping interests in Italy, Mr. McGregor," the Chief Justice said, sipping his brandy. "A fascinating business, I should think." "Indeed, my lord," Charles replied carefully, "though not without its challenges." "I imagine not." Harrington studied him with intelligent eyes, particularly given recent events. The Duke of Ravenshire's shipping connections through his mother's family must be experiencing considerable disruption with his current situation. Charles maintained his composure with effort. Was this a trap? A test? Or was Harrington simply making conversation? "I confess I'm not familiar with His Grace's business interests," he replied cautiously. "Our firm is modest by comparison." Of course. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. "Still, a curious business altogether. A duke allegedly abducting his own Duchess, fleeing London under cover of darkness. Not the behavior one expects from a man of Ravenshire's reputation." "Perhaps there's more to the story than has reached the public ear," Charles suggested, careful to maintain his Edinburgh accent. "There usually is." Harrington's smile was slight but knowing. "In my experience, Mr. McGregor, when a man of previous impeccable standing suddenly behaves in a manner contrary to everything society believes of him, there are typically compelling reasons." Charles felt a prickle of awareness. "You sound sympathetic to His Grace's position." "Let us say I reserve judgment until all facts are known." Harrington set down his glass, a habit that has served me well in my profession. Before Charles could respond, Lord Pembroke joined their conversation, effectively ending any further discussion of the Ravensshire situation. But Charles had received the message clearly. Lord Harrington was not entirely convinced by Blackthorn's version of events. An ally, perhaps, or at least not an enemy. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, Charles observed Margaret engaged in animated conversation with the Duchess of Richmond, a formidable society matron with significant influence. From Margaret's relaxed demeanor and the Duchess's interested expression, he gathered that she too was playing her role to perfection. Lady Danbury caught his eye across the room and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The evening was proceeding exactly as planned. Later, when most guests had retired, Charles, Margaret, and Lady Danbury met in her private study to review the night's events. "You were both exemplary," Lady Danbury declared, pouring small measures of brandy for each of them. "Pembroke suspects nothing." "Lord Harrington made a rather pointed reference to our situation," Charles noted, describing their conversation. "Almost as though he was testing my reaction." Lady Danbury smiled. "Edward Harrington has been a friend for 30 years. While I haven't shared your identity, I may have intimated that the Ravensshire scandal is not as straightforward as Blackthorn claims." "Is that wise?" Margaret asked, concern evident in her voice. "Calculated risk," Lady Danbury replied. "Harrington detests injustice more than he fears social controversy. When the moment comes to present our evidence, he will be receptive rather than dismissive. And when will that moment come? Charles asked the question that had been foremost in his mind throughout the evening. Lady Danbury's expression grew serious. Sooner than originally planned, a messenger arrived during dinner with news from London. Blackthorn has convinced the Lord Chancellor to declare you both legally incompetent, Charles. He's petitioning for control of the Ravenshire estates as your former guardian. He can't do that, Margaret exclaimed. Charles is 30 years old, not a minor. He can if he presents sufficient evidence of mental instability, Lady Danbury corrected grimly. And apparently, he has several physicians prepared to testify that both of you suffer from shared delusion regarding your family histories. Charles's jaw tightened. Blackthorn moves more quickly than we anticipated. Indeed, which means we must accelerate our own plans. Lady Danbury rose, moving to her writing desk. I've already sent messages to my contacts in London. The Duke of Richmond returns to town tomorrow and has agreed to carry communications for me. What do you propose? Margaret asked. A trap, Lady Danbury said simply. We allow word to leak that evidence exists, evidence that could destroy Blackthorn. But we don't specify what or where. He'll panic, Charles realized. Start searching for any overlooked documents, any witnesses he failed to silence. Precisely. And in doing so, he may reveal himself further. Lady Danbury's smile was predatory. Meanwhile, Lord Harrington will quietly begin an investigation into the circumstances surrounding your parents' deaths and William Blackwood's disappearance. Margaret considered this. We're still fugitives, officially. How do we present our evidence without risking immediate arrest? That, my dear, is where the final piece of our strategy comes into play. Lady Danbury withdrew a sealed letter from her desk. This is from the Duke of Richmond to the Prince Regent himself, requesting a private audience on a matter of grave importance to the realm. Charles's eyebrows rose. Richmond would do this? Richmond despises Blackthorn almost as much as I do, Lady Danbury replied. Their rivalry dates back to their youth. He's delighted at the prospect of exposing his old enemy, particularly with such irrefutable evidence. The Prince Regent, Margaret repeated softly, the enormity of their plan dawning on her. We seek justice from the highest authority in the land. Nothing less will suffice, Lady Danbury confirmed. Blackthorn's influence runs too deep in normal channels. Only by appealing directly to the Crown can we ensure both justice and your protection. Charles exchanged a glance with Margaret, reading the same determination in her eyes that burned within him. When do we leave for London? 3 days hence, Lady Danbury answered. Time enough for my preparations to be complete, for Richmond to secure the audience, and for Blackthorn to begin making mistakes in his panic. And until then? Margaret asked. Until then, my dear McGregors, Lady Danbury replied with the hint of a smile, you continue to be the most unremarkable guests at my autumn house party. 3 days passed, with excruciating slowness. Charles and Margaret maintained their disguises flawlessly, joining shooting parties and card games with appropriate enthusiasm, but never drawing undue attention. Pembroke remained suspicious, but found no concrete reason to question their identities. On the evening before their planned departure, as guests gathered for dinner, a commotion in the entrance hall drew everyone's attention. Lady Danbury, forewarned by her butler, remained calm as the dining room doors opened to admit an unexpected visitor. Lord Blackthorn himself stood framed in the doorway, his aristocratic features arranged in a mask of polite apology. My dear Agnes, he said smoothly, bowing to Lady Danbury, forgive the intrusion. Urgent business requires my presence in the area, and I thought to pay my respects. Lady Danbury's expression revealed nothing of her shock. Reginald, how unexpected. We've just sat down to dinner, but another place can certainly be arranged. Charles felt Margaret tense beside him, though her face remained pleasantly neutral. This was the moment their disguises would face their greatest test. Blackthorn's sharp eyes swept the assembled company, lingering briefly on each face. When his gaze passed over Charles, then Margaret, Charles held his breath. But the Earl showed no sign of recognition. Most kind, Blackthorn replied to Lady Danbury. Though I've already dined, perhaps I might join you afterward for cards. Of course. Lady Danbury signaled to her butler. Show Lord Blackthorne to the blue salon. We shall join him when dinner concludes. As Blackthorne withdrew, Charles caught Lady Danbury's warning glance. This unexpected development threatened everything, yet might also provide opportunity. If they could maintain their disguises under Blackthorne's direct scrutiny, their eventual revelation would be all the more devastating. Dinner proceeded with an undercurrent of tension that only those aware of the true situation could perceive. When the ladies withdrew, Charles found himself seated directly across from Blackthorne during the gentleman's brandy. "MacGregor, is it?" Blackthorne inquired casually. "Recently from Italy, I understand." "Yes, my lord," Charles replied, deliberately softening his voice to an unremarkable tenor quite different from his normal aristocratic tones. "Florence, primarily. Shipping interests, Agnes mentioned." "Indeed, though modest ones." Blackthorne nodded absently, clearly finding nothing of interest in the conversation. "Curious business with the Duke of Ravenshire, wouldn't you say? The entire country searching for him and his Duchess." "I confess I'm not well informed on London scandals," Charles responded carefully, having been abroad so long. "No great loss," Blackthorne dismissed. "A regrettable case of inherited instability. His mother showed similar tendencies toward the end." Charles fought to maintain his bland expression, even as rage burned within him at this casual slander of his mother. "How unfortunate," he managed. "Indeed, I did my best for the boy, as his guardian. Some weaknesses of character simply cannot be corrected, even with the most diligent guidance." The conversation mercifully shifted as Lord Harrington joined them, steering discussion toward hunting prospects in the area. Charles caught the Chief Justice's evaluating glance. Harrington had clearly noticed his tension during Blackthorne's comments. When the gentlemen rejoined the ladies for cards, Charles positioned himself where he could observe but not directly interact with Blackthorne. The Earl paid particular attention to Margaret, however, partnering her at whist along with Lady Danbury and the Duke of Richmond. "You play well, Mrs. MacGregor," Blackthorne commented as Margaret successfully finessed a difficult hand. "Uncommon skill for a merchant's wife. My father believed in education beyond the usual accomplishments, my lord," Margaret replied with just the right balance of modesty and pride. "Indeed?" Something in Blackthorne's tone suggested more than casual interest. "And who was your father, if I might inquire?" "Robert Sinclair of Edinburgh," Margaret answered smoothly, using the background Lady Danbury had prepared. "A professor of mathematics at the university." Blackthorne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sinclair, the name is familiar." "A common Scottish name, my lord," Lady Danbury intervened, "like Campbell or MacDonald." "Perhaps," Blackthorne conceded, though his gaze lingered on Margaret's face with uncomfortable intensity. "There's something about your eyes, Mrs. MacGregor, that strikes a chord of memory." Margaret met his gaze with perfect composure. "I'm flattered you find them memorable, my lord, though I assure you we have never previously met." The Duke of Richmond cleared his throat pointedly. "I believe it's your play, Blackthorne." The moment passed, but Charles noted how Blackthorne continued to study Margaret throughout the evening. Not with recognition, precisely, but with nagging suspicion, as though confronted with a puzzle his mind could not quite resolve. Later, in the privacy of their suite, Margaret paced anxiously. "He knows. Not consciously, perhaps, but something about me triggered his awareness." "Not surprising," Charles replied, though he shared her concern. "You're the daughter of his first victim. Some resemblance to William Blackwood may have registered, even if he can't place it precisely. We need to leave, tonight." Margaret's usual calm had given way to genuine fear. "If he realizes who we are—" A soft knock interrupted her. Lady Danbury entered without waiting for acknowledgement, her expression grave. "Blackthorne has sent riders to Ravenshire Lodge," she informed them. "My gamekeeper intercepted a message. He knows the vault was breached and suspects the documents are now in circulation." "How?" Charles demanded. "How could he know?" "McTavish, I fear." Lady Danbury's voice held genuine regret. "My sources report he was found dead yesterday, apparently by his own hand, though I doubt the truth of that. Before his death, he likely revealed your presence at the lodge, possibly under duress. Margaret sank onto a chair, the implications clear. Then Blackthorn knows we have the evidence. He'll be looking for us with even greater determination. Indeed. Which is why our plans must change. Lady Danbury's expression was resolute. You leave for London within the hour. Not by my carriage as planned, too obvious now. My gamekeeper will take you through the estate's southern border, where Richmond's coach waits. He's already departed for London, ostensibly to attend to urgent business, but left his personal carriage for your use. Charles nodded, immediately shifting to practical considerations. What of our evidence, the copies you distributed? Already en route to London by separate messengers. Lord Harrington departed immediately after cards, carrying his portion without knowing its significance. By the time Blackthorn realizes the McGregors are missing, you'll be halfway to London. And you? Margaret asked, concern evident. Won't Blackthorn suspect your involvement when we disappear? Lady Danbury smiled grimly. Let him suspect. I've weathered worse storms in my decades navigating society. Besides, he would never move openly against his sister-in-law. Too scandalous, too easily traced back to him. Charles wasn't convinced. We can't leave you to face him alone. My dear boy, Lady Danbury said with unexpected gentleness. I've been preparing for this confrontation since your mother's death. Agnes Danbury is not without resources or allies. Now go. Change back into traveling clothes. McGregor waits at the East Terrace with provisions and directions. As she turned to leave, Margaret impulsively embraced her. Thank you for believing us, for helping us. Lady Danbury returned the embrace briefly. Your mother would have done the same for my daughter, had our positions been reversed. She stepped back, aristocratic reserve reasserting itself. Now, make haste. The future of both your families depends on reaching London before Blackthorn realizes his prey has flown. Within 20 minutes, Charles and Margaret had abandoned their McGregor disguises and changed into practical traveling clothes. They slipped from Danbury Lodge as silently as they had arrived, guided by the faithful gamekeeper through moonlit gardens and into the sheltering darkness of the surrounding forest. Richmond's coach, elegant but unmarked, awaited them at the predetermined location. The driver, a trusted retainer of the Duke's household, asked no questions as they boarded, simply confirming their destination before setting off at a pace that prioritized stealth over speed until they were well away from Danbury land. As the coach moved steadily southward, Margaret leaned against Charles, exhaustion finally claiming her now that immediate danger had passed. We're close, he murmured, stroking her hair. So close to ending this. If we reach London safely, she replied. If the Prince Regent grants audience. If our evidence is deemed sufficient. So many ifs, Charles acknowledged. Yet we've come further than anyone might have expected when you first disappeared from London. Margaret smiled faintly. When I left that map for you to find, I never truly believed you would follow it. No? No. She looked up at him, her expression softening in the dim lantern light of the coach. The Duke of Ravenshire I thought I knew would have announced my disappearance to society, perhaps made a token effort to locate me, then continued his proper ducal existence. And the man you know now? The man I know now would cross oceans to find me. Her voice held certainty. As I would for him. Charles pressed a kiss to her forehead. Then Blackthorn has given us one gift, however unintended. He forced us to discover what might have taken years to find otherwise. Each other, Margaret said softly. Our true selves. Precisely. Charles tightened his arm around her. Whatever awaits in London, whatever justice or danger, that discovery cannot be taken from us. Margaret nestled closer, her breathing gradually slowing as sleep claimed her despite the coach's steady motion. Charles remained awake, watching the Scottish countryside give way to northern England as dawn broke on what promised to be the most consequential day of their lives. By this time tomorrow, they would either have exposed one of England's most powerful men as a murderer and thief, or they would have failed, condemned to flee the country as the very fugitives Blackthorn had painted them to be. But whatever the outcome, Charles realized, they would face it together. No longer the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, united by arrangement, but Charles and Margaret, bound by something far more powerful. The truth, and love, born of that truth. London, 1833. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of Ravenshire House glittered with candlelight as the cream of London society gathered to celebrate the anniversary of what newspapers now called the Blackthorn affair. Musicians played from the gallery, liveried footmen circulated with champagne, and at the center of it all stood the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, once scandal's primary subjects, now its most fascinating survivors. Margaret, radiant in a gown of deep emerald that matched her eyes, accepted compliments with the perfect blend of grace and warmth that had made her the toast of the season. The past year had transformed her from the perfect but distant Duchess into a woman of substance and influence, whose salon attracted politicians and intellectuals alongside the usual aristocratic crowd. Charles, watching his wife from across the room as he conversed with the Prime Minister, felt a now familiar surge of pride and admiration. How different this gathering from the formal, sterile entertainments they had previously hosted, events where they had moved like well-rehearsed actors playing parts assigned by society rather than chosen by inclination. "Your Grace." Lady Danbury appeared at his elbow, resplendent in silver silk that complemented her hair. A triumph by any measure. Charles smiled warmly at the woman who had helped orchestrate their vindication. "None of it would have been possible without you, Lady Danbury." "Nonsense. I merely provided a stage. You and Margaret wrote and performed the drama." Her shrewd eyes assessed the gathering. And what a performance it was. Society hasn't been so thoroughly captivated since Wellington returned from Waterloo. Indeed, the events following their arrival in London had unfolded with theatrical precision. The Prince Regent, intrigued by the Duke of Richmond's mysterious request, had granted private audience at Carlton House. There, Charles and Margaret had presented their evidence, the documents salvaged from Ravenshire Lodge, his mother's final letter, and additional testimony gathered by Lady Danbury's extensive network. Blackthorn, summoned to explain himself, had arrived expecting to find his ward and ward's wife declared incompetent. Instead, he had walked into a tribunal of sorts, with the Prince Regent himself presiding and Lord Chief Justice Harrington in attendance. The Earl's legendary composure had shattered when confronted with evidence of his crimes. His desperate attempt to discredit Charles and Margaret had only reinforced their claims, and his final, frantic accusation that William Blackwood still lived, intended as distraction, had instead launched a new investigation. "Have you had word from the West Indies expedition?" Lady Danbury asked, as though following his thoughts. Charles nodded slightly. "A letter arrived yesterday. They've located the plantation where a man matching William Blackwood's description was held until 1825. The trail continues to Barbados." "And you believe he may still live?" "Margaret hopes," Charles replied carefully. "I encourage that hope while preparing her for disappointment. After 20 years, the chances seem remote. Yet not impossible," Lady Danbury noted. Crawford and Blackthorn demonstrated remarkable determination in keeping their secrets. Maintaining William Blackwood in distant exile would align with their other efforts. Before Charles could respond, a ripple of attention moved through the ballroom as the latest arrivals were announced. The Duke and Duchess of Richmond and Lord Chief Justice Harrington. Their most powerful allies had come to commemorate the victory they had helped secure. Blackthorn now resided in the Tower, awaiting trial for multiple murders and financial crimes. His estates and titles remained in limbo, their disposition dependent on final judicial rulings. Crawford's legacy had been dismantled more thoroughly. All assets proven to have originated with William Blackwood had been transferred to Margaret's control, while the remainder had been distributed among Crawford's legitimate business partners who had suffered from his manipulations. "Quite a change from last year," Richmond commented as he joined their conversation. "When the two of you arrived at Carlton House, looking like fugitives from a Highland storm." Charles laughed. "An accurate description, Your Grace, though I prefer to think we carried the experience with dignity." "More than dignity," Harrington added, accepting champagne from a passing footman. "Courage few in this room could match. society forgets too quickly that beneath the celebrations lies a tale of remarkable endurance. Across the room, Charles watched as Margaret excused herself from her circle of admirers and moved toward the terrace doors. Understanding her need for a moment's respite from the constant attention, he made his apologies to his companions and followed. He found her on the moonlit terrace, gazing over the garden where spring flowers had begun their annual emergence. Without speaking, he moved to stand beside her, offering silent companionship. "A successful evening," Margaret observed after a moment. "Lady Jersey actually apologized for believing the rumors about our madness. Only took a year and the complete disgrace of an earl to convince her." Charles chuckled. "Society's memory is convenient. Next season they'll claim they never doubted us." "Does that bother you?" she asked, studying his face in the silver light. "Not particularly." He covered her hand with his own where it rested on the stone balustrade. "Society's opinion seems less consequential now that I've discovered more important truths." Margaret smiled, turning toward him. "Such as?" "Such as the fact that titles and position mean nothing without purpose behind them. That courage can be found in the most unexpected circumstances. That love, real love, grows from truth rather than arrangement." Charles raised her hand to his lips. "That the woman I married is far more extraordinary than the Duchess I thought I needed." "Careful, Your Grace," she teased gently. "Such sentiments border on impropriety for a duke." "Perhaps I'm not merely a duke anymore," he replied. "Perhaps, like you, I've discovered the person beneath the title." Margaret's expression softened. "I rather prefer that person to the perfect duke I married, as I prefer the woman to the perfect duchess." The sounds of the ball continued behind them, music and laughter, the harmonious noise of celebration. Yet here, in this quiet moment, Charles felt they celebrated something far more significant than social vindication or justice served. They celebrated transformation. The journey that had begun with a mysterious map and a desperate flight had ended with discovery, not just of truth and justice, but of themselves and each other. "Do you ever wonder," Margaret asked softly, "what might have happened if I hadn't received that letter? If we had continued as we were, the proper Duke and Duchess fulfilling our arranged roles?" "Sometimes," Charles admitted, "we might have maintained that facade indefinitely, might never have discovered what lay beneath." "A tragedy greater than any Blackthorn devised," she observed. "Indeed." Charles drew her gently into his arms. "Though I prefer to focus on what we gained, rather than what we might have lost." Margaret rested her head against his shoulder, fitting perfectly, as though designed for precisely this embrace. "As do I." From the ballroom came the opening notes of a waltz. Without discussion, they began to move together on the moonlit terrace, dancing not for society's approval, but for the simple joy of shared movement. "I received another letter today," Margaret said as they turned beneath the stars. "From the investigator in Barbados." Charles held her gaze steadily. "And?" "A man matching my father's description was living there as recently as 3 months ago, using the name William Black." Hope illuminated her features. "Charles, he could still be alive." "Then we shall find him," he promised, "together, as we've done everything this past year." Margaret's smile was radiant. "I never imagined when I fled London with that false map that the journey would lead us here." "To a terrace dance?" "To truth," she corrected gently. "To a real marriage rather than an arranged one. To love born of shared danger and discovery rather than social expectation." Charles drew her closer as they continued their private waltz. "The map may have been false, but it led to the truest destination of all." Above them, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on midnight blue silk. Behind them, society celebrated their triumph over scandal and injustice. Before them stretched a future neither could have imagined when their marriage began. A future built on foundation far stronger than title or arrangement. "Together," Charles murmured, echoing the promise that had sustained them through their extraordinary journey. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Margaret's eyes, reflecting starlight, held absolute certainty. Together, and in that single word lay everything they had discovered, everything they had become, everything they would build in the years ahead. Not the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire, but Charles and Margaret, two people who had found each other only by losing the masks society had placed upon them. Two people who had discovered that sometimes a false map leads to the truest destination of all. Life often places us on unexpected journeys. When pride and misunderstanding stand between two hearts, the path to reconnection requires courage and vulnerability. The story of Charles and Margaret reminds us that true connection happens not in grand ballrooms or through social expectations, but in moments of authentic revelation. Their journey teaches us that sometimes we must lose ourselves, our titles, our masks, our comfortable pretenses, to truly find each other. That love flourishes not in perfection, but in shared struggle, mutual respect, and the willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the person beneath. Most importantly, their tale reminds us that it's never too late for a second chance. That even after years of distance, hearts can find their way to one another when truth finally prevails over appearance. May we all have the courage to drop our masks, to see and be seen for who we truly are, and to discover that love's most fertile ground isn't perfectly manicured gardens, but the wild, unexpected paths that challenge us to grow beyond who we thought we were. If you enjoyed The Rejected Duchess, please subscribe to our channel for more historical romance adventures. Like this video if you believe in second chances, and share it with someone who appreciates tales of love that triumph over adversity. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts on Charles and Margaret's journey from arranged marriage to true partnership. Until our next story unfolds.